Chapter 847. Soren's power came from the death of the trial taker. The test from the war chess plane involved too many things because it also involved the source of the divine realm, that was, where the power of faith came from. Spirit? If it was really spirit, then the source of faith could not be limited to the material plane. Slaughter could draw energy from the trial, then what about death? What about war? If the illusion of the war chess trial had no effect, then when the number of trial takers reached a certain number, could it completely replace the illusion? Soren gained very little energy through the war chess trial, but when the amount accumulated to a certain extent, the quantitative change had begun to cause qualitative change. As a high god, Soren's life was immortal, so he had enough time to study all this. At this moment, Soren found that if he survived the Avatar crisis safely, he would not have to worry about having nothing to do for the next few hundred years. The preliminary test results of the war chess plane had come out. When the 3 trial takers died, Soren waved his hand to turn off the energy supply of the war chess trial, and then began to sort out the data collected by the divine perception. The power comes from the death of the trial takers. Most of the consumed energy comes from the elemental pool. Maybe I can test the combat mode of the trial takers after a while. Soren thought about it and recalled many popular virtual combat simulations in his previous life. He needed to see if there would be any changes in the combat between the trial takers, because the demon scene in the war chess plane could not test too much data. And the most important point was that the war chess plane was dangerous. Soren needed to ensure the safety of the trial takers and reduce their cost and side effects to a certain extent. If he wanted to promote it in the future, he would definitely not just let high-grade professions enter. Ordinary people might really die in the real world after entering it. This was a very important problem. Soren had to solve this problem even if the collected power would be a lot less. Of course, he still had some bolder ideas in his mind at the moment, such as letting Mordor enter the era of professionals. It wasn't difficult for a commoner to become a professional because there was a great profession called warrior. As long as a commoner's talent wasn't too bad and their body didn't have any innate defects, then they could become a warrior through regular training. The militia training of Mordor City had trained many warriors, but unfortunately, most of them had very low professional levels. They were basically level 1 to 3, and with time they could reach level 3 to 5. If a warrior wanted to break through level 5, then they needed a certain amount of talent and on-the-spot combat. In the real world, the warriors' on-the-spot training either depended on fighting or fighting in person. If the war chess plane could make up for this, Soren could form a perfect balance between the cost and the gain. Through the war chess plane, ordinary warriors could be trained in the real world to make up for their energy consumption. Once this perfect balance was formed, the number of warriors in Mordor City would greatly increase. At that time, at least 70% of the adult males in Mordor City would be able to become warriors. Of course, it was still difficult for ordinary families to afford the nutritional consumption of meat to train a warrior. If Soren really needed to do this, he must get financial subsidies from the city hall. However, the location of Mordor City was overseas, and there was no shortage of fish overseas. In this regard, meat was not a problem. The key was the need for a systematic training model. When Soren left the war chess half-plane, all 3 contestants were also sent out. Unsurprisingly, all 3 of them ended in death. The only difference was that Haruk died from the siege of the low-grade demons, and the Drow warrior died from the decapitation of the mid-grade flying demons. The only one who lasted the longest was Idu. He fought until the last soldier was killed by the demons, but at that time he had killed more than 3 times the demon army. Soren could not help but pay more attention to this person. It seemed that he came from Autumnfall and seemed to have potential. Soren even knew his name. Among the 3 of them, Haruk's personal strength was the highest, the Drow warrior was the best at one-on-one fighting, and Idu was the most strategic. They could all be talents if they were trained. The environment could create talents, because Mordor City had many opportunities that other cities would never give them. Even a slave in Mordor City would have a bright future as long as he had the ability and was willing to work hard. The test is complete. Gloria was waiting for Soren in the laboratory. When she saw him appear, she whispered, "What's the result?" Soren thought for a moment and said, "Very good. But there are still some problems." "Right. How's the research on the floating ship?" Gloria stretched out her hand, and a projection appeared in front of Soren. This was a spell similar to Mirage, which was the research result of the Northern Witch Council. She looked at Soren and smiled. She pointed to the mirror image in front of her and said, "It's almost successful. The only problem at present is the energy drive. Although it can be charged in Mordor City, it can only be done by wizards in other places. According to the tests of my apprentices, it takes about 2,000 Kindler to go back and forth from Arendelle to Mordor City. Gloria already had an independent witch group under her. She was originally a high-ranking member of the Northern Witch Council. If she had the status and resources of Mordor City, she would already have an independent witch group of more than 100 people. 2,000 Kindler? Soren frowned when he heard this. Although Arendelle was far from Mordor City, the consumption of 2,000 Kindler, plus the consumption of the sailors, could reach more than 3,000 Kindler. In other words, the floating ship could only carry out the trade of at least 3,000 Kindler in theory. This was tantamount to denying the transportation of the most basic food and daily necessities, because a ship's cargo might not be as high as the freight, but other expensive goods were not a problem. Very good. After thinking about it, Soren said in a deep voice, I'll leave for Arendelle in a while. It just so happens that there is a batch of goods that needs to be transported from the Northern Witch Council recently. When the time comes, try to get 3 floating ships and we'll do a preliminary test. After the outbreak of the Avatar crisis, the trade routes on the mainland were basically blocked by various wandering monsters. If Soren could do this well, Mordor City would soon have a steady stream of funds. Gloria nodded gently, then raised her hand to lift her long hair and said, Pastor Jean seemed to want to visit me yesterday. It seems that the Church of Riches also knows about this. If we operate it well, we may be able to get a lot of money from it. What was the most important thing for the Lady of Riches? It was not making money. It was to continue to maintain the prosperity of trade. Even if the Church of Riches paid for it, it would be fine because the prosperity of trade was closely related to her priesthood. Soren needed a lot of money now. A lot of money because not only Gloria's experiment needed money, but he also needed a lot of money for the transformation of the war chest plane. And the amount of money would be very large. Chapter 848. Everything in the city of Mordor was built with money. Soren had never pursued any luxury. All his accumulated wealth was either used to improve his strength or subsidize the consumption of the city of Mordor. Otherwise, Soren could definitely live a more luxurious life than a king, but as a god he did not care about material enjoyment at all. In the future, as long as he entered the divine kingdom, then Soren could do whatever he wanted, because there was a kingdom's resources for him to squander. 3 days later. It was a very peaceful day. However, for the residents of Mordor, there were still a lot of novelties today, such as a ship docked in midair at the dock. At this moment, many people had gathered around the port of Mordor, not only the residents of Mordor, but also many merchants from the south coast and other places. At this moment they all looked at the airship in front of them in shock. They weren't unfamiliar with this thing because, from an outsider's point of view, the entire airship was a boat. It was just that the sails had been replaced by balloons, and a propeller-like object had been installed at the rear. Merchants were born with a keen vision to pursue profits. So when they saw the airship for the first time, they realized the huge business opportunity hidden in it, and then they inquired about it from the higher-ups of Mordor through their own connections. The officials of the city hall had met several groups of people who wanted to send gifts and inquire about information today. In particular, some old chambers of commerce controlled by aristocrats on the south coast directly asked if the floating space tower was for sale. As long as they were willing to sell it, the price was not a problem. Business opportunity was only one aspect. On the other hand, the forces behind the merchants realized the strategic value of the airship. Although this thing was far inferior to the floating space tower of Mordor, if a warship could fly and there were several cannons on it, it was also amazing combat power. At least you could defeat a lot of enemies in the sky. The situation was better than Sauron had imagined, because on the first day of the airship's display, many people had expressed interest in it. There were also aristocrats from the Chamber of Commerce in Arendelle who secretly said that they could buy it at a high price. At this moment. Recently, Soren and Gloria were in dire need of money, so they didn't hold back. Seeing that the response was good, they immediately doubled the price. A standard airship modification cost 60,000 Kindler coins. The net profit was about 45,000 Kindler units. Even though Soren had offered such a high price, a batch of floating space tower modifications were quickly sold out. The Northern Witch Council ordered one, the Wizard Alliance ordered one, probably to buy it back for research. Then the nobles of Arendelle ordered 3 custom-made ships. There were many old nobles in the wealthy Arendelle who had accumulated a lot of wealth, followed by 1 order from the Southern Duchy and 2 orders from the Chamber of Commerce of the Eastern Kingdom. Even the Chamber of Commerce, secretly controlled by the Principality of Rossard, secretly placed a batch of orders. Soren naturally wouldn't go against money. The technical content of the airship was not high. The core was still the application of energy and floating space ring. Part of the technology of floating space ring had been sold, but the core material for the production of thorium was still in his hands. In other words, even if the Wizard Alliance and the Northern Witch Council knew how to make floating space rings, they still needed to buy the materials from Mordor City. There was no need to worry about this because the production of thorium required the synthesis of things from the astral world, and the production in Mordor City was not very high. Finally, it was from the Church of Riches. The Lady of Riches was indeed the richest god. She directly placed a dozen orders. 12 airships were 720,000 Kindler units, and Soren made a net profit of nearly 540,000 Kindler units. It had to be said that high-end alchemy technology was really profitable. Soren received the orders sent by the officials of the City Hall on the same day, as well as the deposits paid by many Chamber of Commerce forces. The amount was huge, reaching a terrifying amount of more than 300,000 Kindler units. As long as all the current orders were completed, Soren would earn nearly 800,000 Kindler units in one breath. It was far more than the tax on maritime trade. This is daylight robbery. Soren looked at the order statistics in front of him happily and said to Gloria next to him, "At this rate, we will soon be able to raise enough funds for the second phase of expansion." Gloria's expression was quite calm and she slowly said, "The alchemy technology required for the airship is not high. The Northern Witch Council and the Wizard Alliance will definitely copy it. At most, in a month or two they will be able to make their own airships. I'm afraid our future orders will only be from the south coast. In the future, the focus should be on thorium. Making the floating ring is absolutely inseparable from thorium. Even if they understand the technology, they must buy thorium from Mordor City." Soren nodded and said, "It makes sense. But the number of airships should be a lot by then, and the trade should be restored by then. A conservative estimate. The research of the airships could bring Mordor City about 3 million Kindler units of wealth, and these were all in cash. When the trade was restored, the taxes of Mordor City would also begin to increase. All kinds of benefits would be endless, which greatly made up for the current huge capital consumption of Mordor City. In fact, the Church of Riches had always wanted to send money to Soren. It was just that Soren didn't want it. If he took the money from the Church of Riches, he would have to give up a lot of things in Mordor City. Soren absolutely didn't want the Church of Riches to touch everything inside Mordor City. Letting them develop in the port was already Soren's limit. The interior of Mordor City must be absolutely in his hands. Everything was going on in an orderly manner. Soren received a message from the High Priest. After defeating a group of sea monsters, they successfully approached the location of the pirate island. But they hadn't landed on the island yet because it had become the habitat of the Quitones. This was a kind of large fishmen. Some Quitones were more than 2 meters tall when they stood up. They were far more difficult to deal with than the dark-scale fishmen or other fishman species. Looking at the entire sea area, only the shark man could fight against them. There was a message sent back by the High Priest that interested Soren. It said, "My lord, near the pirate island I feel chaotic magic power. This is not a dead magic area, but I can feel a kind of restriction. It's a bit like a lock, but it's not certain yet. However, low-level spellcasters can easily fail to cast spells here. It's as if there's a force imprisoning the energy here. I suspect it's because of the anti-magic prison, but I'll have to wait until we enter to be sure. P.S. Second update. Follow Stupa on WeChat to make up for your moral integrity." Chapter 849. The existence of the anti-magic prison was very special. For a long period of time, it was used to imprison spellcasters who made mistakes. Moreover, there was an incomparably powerful adept organization behind this prison. This wizard organization was one of the cores of the Arcane Empire. Its strength was far more powerful than the current Northern Witch Council and the Wizard Alliance. The name of this organization was called the Masked Mages Association. There were very clear records. The masked mages controlled a powerful magic lock. Within the range of this magic lock they could even monitor any spell casting. Since a long time ago, the Masked Mages Association began to sell casting licenses within their own sphere of influence. Only by spending money to buy their casting licenses could one cast spells within their sphere of influence. Otherwise, as long as you dared to cast spells outside, even if it was just a small arcane missile, they would find out and find your location. Under normal circumstances, the first violation was just a warning. But if you violated it a second time, the masked mages would attack, capture, or even kill you. This was the rule of their organization. This behavior was naturally nothing to worry about. Because the Masked Mages Association had long been destroyed with the Arcane Empire, Soren was concerned about another point, that was, the Masked Mages Association had mastered the magic net monitoring technology. That's right. They could already monitor the magic net. Although the Masked Mages Association used the power of the magic lock to monitor the magic net in a small area, they could find people who misused magic within their sphere of influence, which already represented some kind of very high-end technology. This technology was of great value to Soren, because if he could transfer it to the city of Mordor, then any signs of casting spells within the city of Mordor could not escape his eyes. He could even use the power of the magic lock to accurately lock the position of the spellcaster. At first, the Masked Mages Association only studied this technology to sell casting licenses, but by the time of the Arcane Empire, this thing had become the symbol of many floating cities. That was, without a casting license, the abuse of magic was not allowed inside the floating city. Soren immediately relayed the news to Gloria after receiving the news from the High Priest. Gloria and the Fallen, which were obviously very interested in the Masked Mage Guild's magic lock technology. However, the High Priestess and the others had yet to discover anything, so everything would have to wait until they found the anti-magic prison. In the blink of an eye, another day had passed. In the blink of an eye, April was coming. During this time, the material plane seemed to be calm, but it was turbulent below. The spies sent by Soren frequently learned about the movements of the elven army, including the high elves who had repeatedly appeared at the border of the Orc kingdom. The battle was about to begin. The invasion of the Orc god system had finally angered the high elves. According to history, Soren estimated that the master god of the elven god system had already entered the elven court. The war was about to break out. This battle between races was a continuation of hatred. The master god of the orcs had lost his eye, so he had endless hatred for the elf god system. Should I make a move? At this moment in the hall of Motor City, Soren had a map in front of him. On it, there were some markings on the location of the elves and orcs. This battle was a battle between the gods. The result of the final outbreak was very terrifying. At least 5 gods were fighting in the battle. The danger was far higher than other conflicts. Although Soren wanted to reduce the disaster of the Avatar crisis, this level of battle between the gods was not something he could intervene in alone. Forget it. Soren sighed and shook his head. He put away the map in front of him and murmured, "Let them fight. If this battle is not fought, the Queen of Spiders, Lolth, will have no chance. Maybe the trajectory of history will begin to change dramatically. Besides, the invasion of the Orc god system may have something to do with the Queen of Spiders." Everything that could not be changed was coming. The hatred between the Orc god system and the Elf god system directly led to the war. A large-scale war would break out on the border around April. At that time, both the elves and the orcs would suffer heavy losses. I can predict the attack of the demons in advance, but the battle between the gods is difficult to change. Soren frowned and fell into deep thought. He could certainly develop in the outer islands for a while, but the outside world was so chaotic. Now the material plane did not have the support of the 3 million paladins. He really did not know if he could survive the last wave of demons and devils. After all, the conspiracy of the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus, dragged the entire material plane into the Bator Inferno. The plane was not constant. Of course, when the power reached a certain level, the law of the world could also be changed. In other words, as long as the power was enough, even the law of the material plane could be forcibly changed into the space of the lower plane. My lord. A slender figure appeared in front of Soren. She was quite beautiful. It was a half-elf rogue. With the strengthening of Soren's power, there were more and more rogues in the church. Half-elves had the advantage of agility, and there were many who had the potential to become excellent rogues. Soren looked down at her and said slowly, "What's the matter?" The slender and tall half-elf knelt on the ground respectfully and then said, "A group of clergymen and priests from the Church of the Lord of Light have recently entered the Principality of Rossard. It seems that it has something to do with the identity of the wife of the Duke of Red Dragon of the Principality of Rossard. They vaguely accused the wife of the Duke of Red Dragon of being a follower of the devil. At present, the Principality of Rossard is in a state of panic, and many nobles are watching." "Is it going to start?" Soren smiled when he heard that. He waved his hand and said, "I see. You can go now." The half-elf rogue bowed and left. Soren looked at the direction of the Principality of Rossard with a sly smile. He was the one who spread the news about the wife of the Duke of Red Dragon being involved with the devil. He didn't expect the Church of Light to react so quickly this time. It hadn't even been a month or two, and they were already preparing to take action against the wife of the Duke of Red Dragon. Very good. Soren glanced at the map and murmured, with the Church of the Lord of Light attacking the wife of the Duke of Red Dragon, I think she won't be able to do anything for the time being. And the archdevil behind her should have a headache. In this case, the devil's plan should be delayed a lot. I can also buy a lot of time. Then next, I should find time to go to the astral plane. Thinking of this, Soren couldn't help but fall into deep thought. His strength was getting stronger and stronger, and there weren't many things that were valuable to him in the material plane. Maybe he should consider digging out the treasures in a few places in the astral plane. It was a pity that the others hadn't been successfully cultivated. Otherwise Soren could explore the corpse of an ancient god floating in the astral plane. Chapter 850. After messing with the Duke of Red Dragon's wife, Soren felt refreshed. However, he still felt that he needed to think about the ancient gods because anything related to the ancient gods was too tempting. The average challenge level was above level 25, and there was a chance that it could reach level 30. Back in the day, even true gods were defeated by the ancient gods. Although there were corpses of ancient gods in the astral plane, they could not be careless because they were the oldest existences in the multiverse. Asmodeus, the Lord of Hell, must be mentioned first. Because he was the creation of the ancient gods, Asmodeus' qualifications were older than many of the old gods of today. The only one who could be compared to him was Luo Shanda's previous life, who was once the ancient god, sun god. The sun god fell because of a catastrophe, and the soul of the god was reincarnated into the Lord of Dawn, Luo Shanda. Then Luo Shanda was promoted to the Lord of Light, after the destruction of the Arcane Kingdom. In fact, if one looked carefully, all the sources of power of this god were interconnected. There was an inscription left in the Age of Thorium. It described Asmodeus as follows. In the beginning of the universe, chaos was everywhere. The demons came uninvited, they represented chaos in the first place. Time had not yet appeared, and due to the nature of chaos, demons killed each other in every part of the universe. This chaos was unbearable for the entire universe, so another force appeared to fight against it, order. The war between the order and the demons began. These newly born gods of order are wearing armor made of pure order power, and they have taken up weapons for their ideals. Then they launched a fierce attack on the demons. This war lasted for countless centuries. The gods of order created a holy book to record their achievements. They also created time because they wanted to know how long it would take to achieve the final victory. Gradually, the gods of order felt that there was no end to the demons. They were tired of the war and wanted to focus on other things such as creating worlds and intelligent creatures. They first created warriors with beautiful wings as servants, and gave them divine spells. These glorious creatures were called angels. Among all the angels, Asmodeus was the most brave and the most beautiful. He has killed more demons than any other angel and even more than any god. But as the eons passed, Asmodeus and the other angels began to pick up some of the characteristics of their enemies. Gradually, their originally beautiful appearance became ugly, and the god of order and other angels began to fear them. That was the end of the inscription. The god of order recorded in the inscription was one of the oldest gods in the multiverse. Strictly speaking, Soren's current divine form belonged to the third generation of gods. The first generation of gods were the ancient gods of order. They didn't need the power of faith and they had terrifying divine power. The second generation of gods were the ancient gods of the plane. The representatives were Mother Gaia, Lord of Storms, Father Oak, and so on. These ancient gods didn't need faith in the past, but now some of them did. Some gods who had given up their priesthood, such as Mother Gaia, also didn't need faith. This was a change in the laws of the universe. The universe was balancing the power of the gods. Therefore, the laws of the gods were also changing. When Soren and the third generation of gods appeared, faith was closely related to the power of the gods. Unless one reached the level of greater divine power, faith could measure the foundation of a god. The huge bodies floating in the astral plane were the first generation of ancient gods. They had many names. If one wanted to, they could even be called titans. Of course, this was just a special name. This was because in the wild field of the multiverse, there was a silent divine kingdom called the Sacred Mountain of Olympus. The full name of the wild field must be mentioned here. Its full name was the Wild Field of the Olympian Forest. Just like the mechanical mirror of Nirvana, these planes all had full names. The name Titans came from this plane, and it was also a unique name for the ancient gods. These were the ancient gods. They had long disappeared in the long river of history. Only some huge bodies were still floating in the astral plane. They all died in the hands of demons. However, they weren't the demons of today. Instead, they were the chaotic species that were even more ancient than the demons of Orbis. The full names of the planes represented history and also had a special meaning. The full names of the planes that Soren knew were the Garden of Joseph in the Hero Domain, Sea of Chaos in the Eternal Chaos, Chaotic Tunnel in the Wind Howling Abyss, Bottomless Abyss, Casserly in the Exile Abyss, Hades in the Grey Field, Scorching Hell in the Eternal Desolation, Bator Inferno in the 9 Levels of Hell, Hell's Battlefield, Mechanical Mirror of Nirvana, Xanadu in the Peaceful Kingdom, Mountain Paradise in the 7 Hills of Heaven, Twin Paradise in the Twin of Eden, Paradise in the Blessed Land, Wild Field in the Endless Wilderness, Wild Field in the Olympian Forest, and Outer Realm of Harmony. This was the multiverse. Countless planes, large or small, made up everything in the multiverse. Even as a god, what Soren saw was only the tip of the iceberg. Just like the Pantheon, even the gods could only see a small area of the structure. The era of the ancient gods had passed. As for their power, it was difficult for the gods to guess. They could only be sure that they were the original existences that created many planes. Now, there were very few gods who had the ability to create planes. This had even become one of the benchmarks of the greater divine power. And the 17 planes above were all created in the era of the ancient gods. Soren gradually woke up from his contemplation. Soon he seemed to think of something. He patted his head and said, "How could I forget this? The secret of the Knoll god, Jianghu." As if he had just woken up, Soren quickly rushed to the study, and then opened many ancient books. He was looking for something. He was looking for a very old record about the Knoll god Jianghu. On the 422nd floor of the abyss, this is the domain of the Storm Lord, the demon of Obylis, Bacchard. Although the betrayal of the demon Tana, finally cut off Bacchard's connection with this floor and drained his vitality from his huge lifeless shell, the pain of Obylis' death had lasted for countless years. Now this huge and strange demon was similar to a twisted beached whale. He could not move on his own and could only be exposed to the scorching sun of this floor. Over and over again, the coastal rock formations that supported his half-dead body were smashed by violent hurricanes or treacherous winds and acid rain. Bacchard's once perfect control of the weather was inadvertently triggered by the unbearable pain of slow death. Although he was no longer able to speak, Bacchard still retained a fragment of his once boundless consciousness. If he communicated through telepathy, he would talk in a slow and melancholy tone about an era long before the birth of Tana, about the rise and fall of the oldest demons. And a trusted frequent visitor might even hear Bacchard say that demons didn't originate from the bottomless abyss. Instead, they migrated here from another place after abandoning a race of evil creators that had already disappeared in the long river of history. Soren's finger stopped on this page of the ancient book. Then, as if he thought of something, his body trembled a little. Obylis demon. There's information about the first generation of demons. There's no need to think about the ancient god's corpse now. This Obylis demon sealed in the territory of the Knoll god has at least intermediate divinity, or even great divinity. If I can take away the power he participated in, then I can have the ability to independently explore the ancient god's corpse. This ancient demon lord, Orbis, who was close to death, was the biggest secret of the Knoll god Jianghu and one of the most common visitors. If he hadn't thought of the ancient gods today, Soren would have almost forgotten about this huge ancient demon stranded in the bottomless abyss. This was a very ancient existence among the Obylis demons, and he even had a direct connection with the first generation of demons. And those ancient gods' corpses floating in the astral world died in the hands of the first generation of demons. P.S. Second update. This volume is coming to an end. The next volume is the content of the ancient god line. Chapter 851. Same old rules. After thinking about it, he decided to tidy up and start writing the 8th volume tomorrow. Yes, that was all. Those with monthly votes could vote for it. Chapter 852. Rolling all over the floor begging for monthly votes. If you don't give monthly votes, you won't take any medicine. You're still cute even if you don't take any medicine. Let me ask you, are you afraid? The double monthly vote seems to have started. Everyone who has monthly votes, please vote for it. The prequel storyline of the 3 death gods has been filled up. The appearance of the 3 death gods from the previous generation to the Dread Lord has been explained. In order to praise Fu Tu for filling up a hole, shouldn't you all vote for a monthly vote to celebrate? Chapter 853. It was drizzling. A strong smell of blood covered this plain. There was a huge gully in front of them. It was the earth that was torn apart by some terrible force. In the distance there was an ancient tree that was still burning. Even the rain could not extinguish the flames on its body. The bodies of orcs and elves were mixed together. The dense corpses were piled up at the forefront. There were broken armors and weapons everywhere. Not far away there was the body of a giant bear. This behemoth, which was about 4 or 5 meters tall, had now been killed by a giant axe. Obviously there had been a fierce battle here. From the situation of the battlefield, there was no winner between the two sides, but the elves' loss was obviously greater. It was still a peaceful day in Motor City. As April was coming to an end, the impact finally broke out. A war broke out between the elves and the orcs. The final result was that there was no winner. The elven divine system and the orc divine system were not much different in strength. Neither side could completely defeat the other. There was also more and more news about the goddess of fortune and the goddess of misfortune. Although the two twins of destiny had not directly fought, the battle in the dark had become more and more obvious. What made Soren quite concerned was that the figure of the goddess of fortune seemed to appear in Arendelle. When he met the incarnation of the goddess of misfortune, it was also near Arendelle. There didn't seem to be much of a change. Time passed little by little, and the adventurer team sent by Soren had arrived at the pirate island. The news from the Eastern Kingdom was also very good. Gloria's witches had built a base in the New World. However, everything came to an end in May. It was a seemingly normal day, at least in the morning. But when the afternoon came, everything in the entire material plane changed. Soren disconnected from the divine network in an instant, and then the divine light above the cathedral of Motor City became dim. At this moment, all of Soren's priests lost the ability to cast divine spells, and all the wizards and priests in the entire material plane could not cast any spells at all. The magic network disappeared. An invisible force that enveloped the entire world disappeared. The first to react was Soren. He took the initiative to connect to the faith of the city of Mordor almost instantly, and then used his god-level computing ability to bestow divine spells to his believers. The second batch of people who felt the disappearance of the weave were legendary wizards like Gloria. She appeared in front of Soren almost instantly and said with a serious expression, "The goddess of magic is in trouble. We have no way of connecting to the weave." This storm silently affected the entire material plane. The Northern Witch Council activated the magic lock almost instantly, and a light rose from Arendelle's palace. The Wizard Alliance was temporarily closed to the outside world, and then a light curtain enveloped the entire city. The brilliance of all the temples in the material plane dimmed, but the first to recover were the many great divine powers, followed by the gods with intermediate divine powers. As for the gods with weak divine powers and below, the brilliance of their temples had been reduced by more than 30%. Something happened to the goddess of magic. At this moment, all the gods in the material plane, whether good or evil, had been aware of this. Because the existence of the weave was not only for all wizards, but also for the space above the 9th layer of the weave, which had been transformed into a divine network to help the gods return faith and bestow divine spells to their believers. But now that the weave of faith had disappeared, the gods could only rely on their own ability to feed back divine spells to their believers. Otherwise, the priests who served them would not be able to cast any divine spells. Soren's expression was very solemn. He glanced at Gloria and sighed, "I didn't expect this to happen in the end." The goddess of magic was in trouble. Soren was not sure if she had fallen, but judging from the disappearance of the weave, she was definitely in serious trouble now. The weave collapsed. Although Soren had shortened the time of the outbreak of this catastrophe and made a lot of efforts, he did not expect it to happen in the end. The weave of faith had disappeared along with the weave. The power of the gods was weakening. If the weave was still around, the gods could still crush the mortals. But now, with the collapse of the weave of faith, the process of the weave of faith had become even more difficult for the gods to recover their divine power. The disappearance of the weave made all the spellcasters feel uncomfortable. Even Soren, who had become an arcanist, found it difficult to cast spells without the help of the weave. It was at least several times more difficult than before. Fortunately, he had already expected this, and Gloria and the others were already prepared. But even so, with the disappearance of the weave, a large number of spellcasters in the material plane would lose their power. Their talent would not be enough to master spells. Half of the witches would be crippled. Many of the witches would only be able to cast low-level spells below the third circle. As for organizations like the Northern Witch Council and the Wizard Alliance, they would probably be facing an even more serious crisis now. The two of them looked at each other without saying a word. The collapse of the weave was a serious blow to the material plane. While it weakened the power of the mortals, it also weakened the power of the gods. The demons and devils would be ready to make a move. What do we do now? The sudden loss of the weave's connection made Gloria a little flustered. She looked at Soren and said, "Without the support of the weave, we will be in a lot of trouble." Soren looked at her and nodded. "Don't panic. You should get used to casting spells without the weave. The great arcanists have always cast spells without the weave. With your talent, you should be able to get used to it quickly. The research progress can be slowed down temporarily. Although the weave has disappeared, I don't sense the fall of the goddess of magic." The goddess of magic was not dead yet. After hearing Soren's words, Gloria couldn't help but calm down a lot. However, at this moment, the figure of the fallen witch also appeared. Her expression was a little panicked, but she still remembered something more important. She looked at Soren and her daughter in front of her and said in a deep voice, "The weave has disappeared. I just returned from the shadow plane. The shadow weave that extended to the shadow plane has also disappeared." "What? The shadow weave has also collapsed?" Soren couldn't help but be startled. Then, as if he thought of something, he muttered, "Could it be that something happened to the goddess of night? The weave and the shadow weave disappeared at the same time. Could it be that the two goddesses had a secret battle?" Chapter 854. The month of May had just begun. The whole world seemed to be in chaos. The power of the gods had suffered a heavy blow. They were forced to leave their divine realms because of the Avatar crisis. At the same time, they had lost their divine forms. Now they could not even access the Faith Network. The power of mortals had also been hit hard. Many spellcasters could not sense the weave, and the low-grade spellcasters who were not talented enough had almost completely lost the ability to cast spells. The collapse of the weave made them feel very uncomfortable. They had been used to the convenience of the weave, and after losing it, they could not control the chaotic magic energy. The role of the weave was not only to provide convenience but also to restrain the magic energy within the range of the weave. This chaos quickly spread to the Underdark because on this day the spellcasters in the Underdark suddenly found that they could not cast spells. This was because the shadow weave had also disappeared. The shadow weave, which was originally created by the Lady of Night imitating the goddess of magic, disappeared at the same time as the weave. Not only were the spellcasters of the Underdark unable to cast spells, but even the priests of the Queen of Spiders had temporarily lost their ability to cast divine spells. For a time, the order of the entire Underdark that was ruled by the female priests with great power was challenged. There were a lot of riots in many drow cities, and the male clan members were all ready to move. The weave had collapsed. Although the whereabouts of the goddess of magic were still unknown, no one was interested in continuing to fight. The Lady of Night's traces had also disappeared. She was no longer responding to the prayers of the believers, and the shadow weave showed no signs of recovery. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. In the underground city of the Underdark, there had been enough turmoil in the past 3 days, and there had been a lot of killings. However, a light appeared on the temple of the Queen of Spiders. The Queen of Spiders, who had not responded to the prayers of the believers for 3 days, suddenly reconnected to the believers. Then many female priests recovered their divine powers. They quickly and cruelly suppressed all the riots, and then took the power of the entire underground city and clan in their hands. The shadow weave had disappeared. However, the gods of the Underdark reacted quickly. 3 days later, the priests who served them had recovered their divine powers. The gods were adapting to the days without the divine network. Even Soren had to spend more time and energy answering the prayers of his believers and giving his priests divine spells. At the same time, Soren noticed that the rate at which his divine power was increasing had slowed down. There was still no news from the goddess of magic. The Northern Witch Council was in turmoil, but fortunately the Eye of the North was in charge. Now the Northern Witch Council had issued a blockade order and temporarily cancelled most of their activities. The entire organization had fallen into a state of retreat. Without the help of the weave, many witches became very weak. Some of them didn't even dare to walk out of their Adept's Tower. It was the same for the Wizard Alliance. The gates of this city had been sealed for 3 whole days. Arcane guards could be seen on the city walls, and a transparent barrier had not disappeared since the start of the battle. The Wizard Alliance rejected all visitors. All of the great wizards had been summoned back, and they were urgently discussing how to deal with the disappearance of the weave. Gloria's spell-casting ability was recovering. She had learned about the Arcanists a long time ago, and now she just needed to go further and spend more energy. The disappearance of the weave had severely damaged all the wizards with intelligence below 20 points. With their talent, it was difficult for them to control spell energy. That was to say, a wizard with an intelligence of about 20 points and a spellcasting level of 6 or above could only cast a level 1 or 2 spell at most. And those wizards who were born with intelligence attributes of less than 16 points and had not reached the middle grade themselves, now it was difficult for them to even cast level 0 spells. Mordor City had also temporarily fallen into a state of semi-closure. The disappearance of the weave required a period of adaptation. The witches under Gloria's command needed to learn new knowledge. They needed to train their spirits and use them to control their magic energy without the weave's restraint. The strength of all the witches was reduced by more than 50%. Fortunately, Mordor City was not supported by the power of spellcasters. After these witches lost many of their abilities, they became the existence that was blessed and protected by Mordor City. Moreover, in just a few days, more and more witches had joined Gloria's ranks. The Eye of the North also sent a letter. The Northern Witch Council also had knowledge about the Arcanists. At present, they hoped that both sides would give up any prejudices in the past and share all the knowledge about the Arcanists' spellcasting. The Wizard Alliance also expressed this idea to Mordor City. They said that they also had some knowledge about the Arcanists. If Mordor City agreed, they would immediately send a great wizard to visit. The collapse of the weave forced the spellcasters of the whole world to start saving themselves. Fortunately, the second wave of the Avatar crisis had ended, and the new wave had not yet arrived, which gave the spellcasters a short buffer time. They had time to adapt to the days without the weave and study how to cast spells without the weave. Or else they would have to face the demon army and the enemies of the past without the ability to cast spells. The disappearance of the weave made many wizards who were once high and mighty feel deeply uneasy. After losing their power, they could only rely on the golems and wizard towers to protect themselves. In just a few days, many wizards had been killed. Most of them were those who coveted their wealth and the enemies they had encountered in the past. In this case, the spellcasters who had no organization were the most miserable. Those who were protected by forces could hide in a safe place for a while. The magic lock of the Northern Witch Council had been closed for 3 days. The wizard city was completely closed to the outside world. Princess Royal of Arendelle also sent a magic message to Soren. Now the spellcasters' organizations in the entire material plane were dealing with the problems after the collapse of the weave. Gloria's witches group increased rapidly. At the same time, the scattered wizards of the City of Wealth, Port Tylon, and Shipwreck Bay also rushed to Mordor City. They were seeking protection from Soren, and most of them were under Saruman's command. Without the weave, they might not even be able to defeat a middle-grade warrior. At this moment of life and death, the once high and mighty spellcasters had to bow their heads and seek refuge in organizations that could temporarily shelter them. The spellcasters of Mordor City had increased to 600 or 700. But even with so many spellcasters, Soren was now facing a problem. That was, only a small part of them had the ability to become Arcanists. Most of the spellcasters had to find other ways to restore their power. Finally, after a whole day of discussion, the Northern Witch Council, Arendelle's Ice Witches, the Mordor City Wizard Legion, the Wizard Alliance and other organizations decided to share knowledge in the future. They must work together to solve the problem caused by the collapse of the weave. P.S. Second update. Seeking attention and recommendation tickets from the public account. Chapter 855. The Goddess of Magic and Lady of Night had an accident at the same time. Although it was not known whether the secret struggle between the two goddesses had an accident or something else had happened. However, the nerves of the gods were obviously nervous because this was the first time since the Avatar crisis that a greater divine power had an accident. Although gods had fallen in the past, they were all weak and weak. Although the Shadow Lord who died in the hands of Soren was a mid-level divine power, he was alone after all. But the Goddess of Magic and Lady of Night were different. Both of them were greater divine powers and had a group of gods serving them. The weave and the shadow weave collapsed at the same time. Two greater divine powers disappeared together, and all believers and priests could not get their response. The Church of Lady of Night was a little better. After all, there were many other professions, but the fate of the organization serving the Goddess of Magic was very tragic. Because there were too many spellcasters, The collapse of the weave directly led to a great reduction in power. Many evil gods who once had a grudge against the goddess of magic were secretly moving. But at this time many other gods also stood up. The Lady of Silver Moon was the first god to stand up publicly to shelter the believers of the goddess of magic. In a sense, she was also the mother of the goddess of magic. Without her struggle with Lady of Night, there would be no goddess of magic. With the Lady of Silver Moon taking the lead, the rest was much easier. Many good gods temporarily sheltered the church of the goddess of magic. Even the goddess of love, who had always been casual, stood up. The mother gods in this world were still relatively powerful. After all, the existence of the goddess of magic was very special. Many gods needed to rely on the faith network of the weave. So after she disappeared, many people were looking for her. Even the gods who did not have a good relationship with her would contribute a little. Because the gods had cut off their connection with the divine kingdom, if they could not even connect to the faith network, their power would be too weak. Recently there were many more spellcasters in Motor City. Not only members from the Northern Witch Council, but also the top members of the Wizard Alliance and Arendelle's Ice Witches. Spellcasters, who were rarely seen in the past, began to appear more often now, and most of them were in a hurry. Many of them lived directly near the library in Motor City. Mordor City was on high alert during this period of time. Any slight disturbance might lead to interrogation by the guards. The number of guards patrolling the port area was also 50% higher than before. How's the progress? Soren went to the war chest plane for a bit. After he came back, he immediately went to Gloria's laboratory and asked, "What are the results of your research so far?" There was a pile of books in front of Gloria. Next to her were the fallen witch and Alice, both of whom looked exhausted. The collapse of the weave made them feel a little haggard. A little. Gloria put down the book in her hand and said slowly, "At present, through the communication with the Northern Witch Council and the Wizard Alliance, we found that the biggest difference between the spellcasting of the Arcane Empire and the current spellcasting is the analysis of spell models. During the time of the Arcane Empire, most spellcasters completely construct spell models. This will slow down their learning speed, but it will give them a deeper understanding of spells. But today's spellcasting relies on spells. Some low-level wizards who are not talented enough can't complete the construction of spell models at all. They can only rely on repeated meditation and spells to form a spell model with the help of the weave. The weave was a connector and a storage device. Soren knew this for a long time because the spell slots he mastered were stored on the weave. If a wizard did not change the spell stored in the spell slot, he could regain the spell with a little meditation. This convenience allowed many wizards with insufficient talent to gain the ability to cast spells, but it also made them dependent on it. Many wizards' spell slots were fixed, and the spells stored in them may not be changed for a long time. With their calculation and understanding ability, they did not fully understand the structure of spell models. Spell models, huh? Soren couldn't help but think back to when he first learned spells. He didn't seem to understand the spells much. Perhaps it was an innate belief that the weave would collapse sooner or later, so Soren started learning spells by constructing spell models. Most of the low-grade magi started with meditation and incantations. Some didn't even know what spell models were. They relied entirely on repeating contact incantations to communicate with the weave, and finally mastered the most basic level, 0 cantrips. Gloria took out a blueprint and showed it to Soren, then said, "Our current test results show that after leaving the weave, most wizards have lost the ability to cast high-level spells. With their intelligence, they can't complete the construction of high-level spell models on their own. The weave provides the convenience of storage and allows magi to obtain more spells. But now that the weave has collapsed, the storage function of the weave has been lost. If a wizard wants to regain the ability to cast spells, they have to memorize spell models again. We've already tested a portion of them. After reconstructing the spell models, more than 50% of the witches were able to cast low-level spells. However, this is only limited to the low-level spells that they have mastered. Normal spellcasters don't have enough memory and understanding. Apart from a few talented wizards, the rest can only recover 3 to 5 types of low-level spells. Any more and it'll be beyond their abilities. However, the test results also showed an interesting phenomenon. After leaving the weave, spellcasters are no longer limited by spell slots. The key to determining how many spells they can cast is their spiritual force and their own mana. Their spellcasting level did not decrease. Our preliminary test results show that a mid-level or high-level wizard who has lost all his other spells can cast Fireball continuously more than 10 times after memorizing the spell model. The number of times they can cast spells is not much different from the number of spell slots they had in the past. Soren couldn't help but fall into silence after hearing this. After pondering for a moment, he raised his head and said, "Simply put, the only difference is that their mana has not decreased. The only difference is that without the weave, they are unable to master many spells. But the spells that they have mastered can be cast many times with their original strength?" The Fallen Witch also raised her head at this time and nodded, "Yes. The results of our research with the Wizard Alliance is that most of the mid-level and low-level wizards do not have the ability to become arcanists. This means that if the weave is not restored, they will only be able to memorize a few spells in their lifetime. They can cast these spells repeatedly like warlocks. However, if they memorize too many spell models and their own memory and comprehension are not enough, I'm afraid that it will cause a serious backlash. They will only be able to become a single type of spellcaster in the future. All the test results show that only those who are extremely talented can cast spells freely like arcanists." Soren was stunned after hearing this. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The era of blue spellcasting has finally arrived. The old spellcasters have fallen to the mortal world. In the future, apart from the geniuses who have the talent to become arcanists, the other spellcasters will only be able to become a single type of canon. The weave was a storage device. Now that they didn't have this storage device, it would be very difficult for them to memorize the complicated spell models with the brains of ordinary people. The only thing they could do now was to try their best to memorize the few spells that they were most familiar with. Chapter 856. After the collapse of the Magic Network. Originally, the one-time memory of the wizards with the help of the Magic Network storage device had to become permanent memory because there were no more spell slots to help them preserve these completed spell models. There was a little detail here. In the past, it took the longest time for wizards to memorize the spell slots. After completing the memory of the spell slots, as long as the spell was cast in the future, it would take very little time to refill the spell slots. Even wizards with poor talent could completely memorize all the spells stored in the spell slots in 8 hours at most. This was one of the biggest functions of the Magic Network. Now that it had lost this function, many wizards had to complete the structure of these spell models independently. The only fortunate thing was that the strength of these spellcasters was still there. That was, the most basic power of the will and the mana accumulated through meditation were still there. For example, Gloria showed Soren an example. A mid-grade magus by the name of Karel. His talent was not high. It was estimated that his intelligence was barely 18 to 20 points, including the profession bonus. His original spellcasting level was around level 8. After the collapse of the Magic Network, he completely lost all his spells. However, after the test in Mordor City and the Wizard Alliance, he remastered the most basic level 1 spell, Arcane Missile, through continuous practice. At present, this was the only level 1 spell he could cast. In the case of only being able to remember to cast this spell, he could cast Arcane Missile more than 30 times in a row before exhausting his power. This meant that his original ability had not disappeared. It was just that he had lost the Magic Network and could no longer master other spells. For a long time in the future, he would only be able to cast some very low-level spells. "What are you going to do now?" Soren frowned and looked at the results of the test carried out by Gloria and others. He slowly said, "There are still many wizards who can't cast spells. We must solve this problem as soon as possible. At least let them protect themselves." Gloria nodded and said, "I know. So the result of our discussion is to let them rememorize the spells they are most familiar with and most commonly used. At present, we can only let them learn warlock techniques, and through repeated practice, they will be able to master spells again. However, in the future, I'm afraid it will be difficult for these people to learn new spells. The types of spells they have mastered may be even less than warlocks. Warlocks relied on their innate ability to cast spells. After the collapse of the weave, the high and mighty spellcasters would only be able to grasp a few spells through constant communication, unless they met the requirements to become arcanists. The weave also existed during the Arcane Empire. A large number of low-ranked spellcasters relied on the weave to cast spells. However, arcanists generally avoided the weave, and if one advanced to become a great arcanist, there would be no problem with the weave. "How's the great Taoist master?" Soren thought for a moment and asked, "Did the Archmage's spellcasting abilities decrease?" The one who answered him was the Fallen Witch. She slowly said, the great wizard's abilities didn't decrease too much. With their talent and understanding of magic, even without the weave, they would be able to cast most magic. However, there will definitely be some effects. The effects they received should be similar to ours. They need to memorize all the spells again. The fallen witch's innate ability was astonishing. She could rely on a person's memory to dismantle and reassemble such a complicated, elemental furnace. Her memory and comprehension were simply at the level of a scientist. The great wizards were all spellcasters who had advanced to become legends. Their innate abilities were outstanding. Even if the weave collapsed, they could easily memorize all the spells. This was something worth rejoicing over. After the collapse of the weave, although the lower-ranked wizards were heavily injured, the wizards above the legend rank weren't affected too much. Then what about your current strength? Soren thought for a moment and asked, do you think your strength has decreased or increased? Gloria frowned and hesitated for a moment before slowly saying, I'm not too sure. However, one thing is certain. After the collapse of the weave, the spells we can use have become much more flexible. Although the original spell slots provided convenience for spellcasters, it also limited the abilities of those with outstanding innate abilities. In the past, when we used spells, we had to limit ourselves to the contents of the spell slots. But now we can use all the spells we know at will. The only way we can use spells is by our spiritual force and mana. Before our mana and spiritual force are exhausted, we can use spells at will. We haven't tested it yet, so I'm not sure if our strength has decreased or increased. Moreover, the convenience of the weave makes it easier to use spells. After leaving the weave, according to our preliminary calculations, the total number of spells we can use should have decreased by around 30%. The weave was a framework, but it was also a restriction. A first circle spell slot could only store first circle spells. Although the usage was maximized, the framework was still there. No one could escape the restrictions of the goddess of magic. Now that the weave had collapsed, without this framework there was no longer this convenience. Relying on one's own ability to use the weave would definitely not be able to compare to it, so the total number of spells they could use had decreased. Of course, unless one only remembered first circle spells, the number of spells they could use would increase exponentially. This was because all the second circle spell slots had been converted into first circle spells. How long will it take for these spellcasters to recover their combat strength? Soren asked the most important question. Gloria pondered for a long time before saying, it's hard to say. Now, it depends on their innate abilities. I estimate that in about a month, most of the spellcasters will recover some spells. But some of them may only be able to use level 0 spells in the future. Without the weave, the reality was cruel. Spellcasters who were not geniuses or quasi-geniuses would be able to use level 0 spells in the future. The existence of the weave naturally had its reasons. The age of thorium was so glorious, but after the death of the first goddess of magic, it was destroyed in history. An arcane civilization could not be supported by the geniuses at the top. If magic was to be popularized, it had to rely on the power of the weave. If the weave could not be restored, the current batch of spellcasters would be slightly better off. From now on, without the help of the weave, it would be much more difficult for anyone to become a wizard. Soren conservatively estimated that they would need at least 18 points of intelligence to become wizard apprentices and master the lowest level 0 spells. After that, they would be able to learn first circle spells when they reached level 4. Note, because wizards can only reach 20 points of intelligence when they reach level 4. The current batch of wizards had accumulated experience and training in the past, so most of their intelligence had already reached 20 points due to their profession level. In the future, the number of wizards would plummet. Without the weave, if it could not be restored or replaced, then the age of chaos would gradually arrive. In the end, the number of spellcasters would become fewer and fewer. Chapter 857. Chidian's backend was going crazy. Fu 2 had already changed the chapter after the repetition yesterday. Those who had already subscribed did not need to subscribe again. The content had already been changed to the third chapter. The new backend was not very useful. Everyone please bear with it. Fu 2 would not deliberately repeat the chapter, otherwise I would have already activated the anti-piracy function. That's all. Chapter 858. A civilization couldn't be supported by a few people. For example, although Motor City had a lot of very sophisticated alchemy technology, the only thing that could be popularized was the magic street lamps. But even just the magic street lamps required a group of low-grade wizards to check and maintain them regularly. As for the golem factories, which had more advanced alchemy technology, there were more than 2 digits of spellcasters for daily maintenance. Usually, if there was any damage to the golem puppets, these things all needed low-grade spellcasters to do. It could be said that without these low-grade spellcasters, Gloria wouldn't have enough time and energy to study. The same principle could be applied everywhere. Cutting-edge experiments could rely on the power of geniuses, but popularization and maintenance required a lot of low-grade manpower. The collapse of the magic net meant that the difficulty of Soren's plan for the floating city skyrocketed. Losing a large number of low-grade wizards would make it difficult to maintain the floating city in the future. This was the same in other civilizations. Scientists discovered a lot of important knowledge, but in the end, countless workers and scholars were needed to promote the overall process of the civilization. The collapse of the magic net was a sign of the end of the era. Looking at the long history of the multiverse, most of the times that could be called interstellar civilizations relied on the magic net to establish themselves. Otherwise, wizards would be the representatives of mystery. Although there weren't many wizards in the material plane because of the magic net, wizards could be seen in almost every town. But if there was no magic net in the future, it would be difficult to see wizards even in big cities. Soren sat in the hall and pondered. He frowned slightly and murmured, "The magic net collapsed in the end. In this case, what about my plan for the floating city?" The power of the magic net was controlled by the goddess of magic. If possible, Soren didn't want to see the magic net disappear because the era without the magic net was a sad era. Where is the goddess of magic now? Did she fall? Soren looked out of the window and whispered, "If the goddess of magic falls, the new successor can regain control of the power of the magic net. Similarly, the magic net will be repaired. In the current situation, should I implement Plan B or Plan C? The fall of the goddess of magic was inevitable in the original history. Although Soren had helped the goddess of magic survive the first crisis, he was still unable to prevent the collapse of the magic net. The only thing he could do was to ensure that the goddess of magic was still alive even though she was missing. The collapse of the weave was one of the most critical factors in the Avatar crisis. That was why Soren had a backup plan a long time ago. Helping the goddess of magic was Plan A that Soren had prepared, and it seemed like Plan A had failed. Because the weave had already disappeared. Soren was a person who was used to acting after making up his mind. Of course, he didn't only have one plan. He had 2 other backup plans. For example, Plan B. In Soren's original plan, if the goddess of magic couldn't escape the fate of death, then he would turn around and help the Silvermoon Lady obtain the power of the goddess of magic. Because the Lady of Silvermoon was one of the creators of the goddess of magic, she could replace the goddess of magic to repair the divine network. Of course. Other than that, Soren also had a Plan C. This plan was much bolder, and he only thought of it after advancing to the mid-level divine power. Because the current goddess of magic, Midnight, used to be just an ordinary witch. She became a god because she inherited the power of the goddess of magic. If Soren had enough cards up his sleeve, he might be able to try to help someone get the priesthood of the goddess of magic. For example, Gloria or Fallen Witch. The difficulty of Plan C was extremely high. But it wasn't completely impossible. Anything could happen in the time of troubles. There were many mortals who became gods in the original history. It was naturally not impossible to seize the priesthood of the goddess of magic from the hands of the gods. But if Soren did this, he would have to face too many enemies. After all, this was a priesthood of greater divine power. To be honest, Gloria or Fallen Witch's abilities were not enough to control the power of the goddess of magic. There was only one way for Gloria to obtain the priesthood of magic. Soren could seize the power of the priesthood and transfer it to her, allowing her to become a god as a mortal. The weave. The shadow weave. Soren frowned as he pondered. He seemed to be hesitating as he muttered, "I have the priesthood of shadow and I am an arcanist. Then? Can I try to obtain or create something similar to the shadow weave?" Soren didn't dare to think about the real shadow weave. But if it was the shadow weave, Soren felt that there was a slight possibility. After all, his control over the shadow plane was very strong. And when Mistress Night first created the shadow weave, it was limited to the Underdark. Mistress Night wasn't a pure spellcaster. She was an ancient god, and her profession was closer to that of a rogue. She had many similarities with Soren. Mistress Night's profession must be mentioned. She was rogue, shadow dancer, assassin, warlock, and shadow manipulator. And Soren's current profession was rogue, shadow dancer, wizard, and arcanist. Wasn't it very similar? That's right. Soren and Mistress Knight's professions were very similar. It could even be said that they were of the same school. The biggest difference was that Mistress Knight was a warlock spellcaster, while Soren was a wizard spellcaster. Perhaps Soren was still far from reaching Mistress Knight's level of ability. But what if it was just a small area of the Shadow Weave? With the power of the Shadow Priesthood and the ability of the Shadow Plane, could Soren build a small area of the Shadow Plane that covered the vicinity of Mordor City? It was very possible. The more Soren thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. However, he still lacked the most important part, and that was to obtain a priesthood related to magic, the Shadow Weave, and the Mystery Plane. He must first obtain such a priesthood before he could try to imitate the Shadow Weave. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to succeed. The existence of the Shadow Weave relied on the power of the priesthood. Without a priesthood related to magic, Soren didn't even have the basic ability to build a magic network. P.S. That's all for today. Next, you have to think about it. Chapter 859. The collapse of the Shadow Weave did not affect Soren much. However, the collapse of the Faith Network had a very serious impact on Soren. With the collapse of the Faith Network, Soren's workload of responding to the prayers of the believers suddenly increased several times. Soren's intention to get involved with the Shadow Weave was to establish his own faith network in the future. Otherwise, it would not be a good way to collect faith with the help of the outside world. Soren did not like to be controlled by others. The power that could be controlled by oneself was the most effective. A week passed in the blink of an eye. The research led by the Wizard Alliance, the Northern Witch Council, the Arendelle Ice Witches, and the city of Mordor finally began to show results. Many adepts had already mastered the spells they were most familiar with through repeated practice. As for how much strength they could recover in the future, it depended on their individual talent and hard work. Speaking of which, after the collapse of the Weave, a good thing happened. That was, a benchmark to measure the talent of a wizard had appeared. In the past, everyone used the power of the Weave to cast spells. It was like a group of students studying at the same time. Their IQs were similar without special tests. At most, some people studied better and some studied worse. Some were more serious and some were more lazy. But after the collapse of the Weave, everyone's talent had a direct measurement, and all of a sudden, all the geniuses among the wizards were distinguished from ordinary people. These quasi-geniuses or genius-level spellcasters easily memorized the spell models and gradually became qualified to become arcanists. After the disappearance of the Weave, such geniuses continued to emerge. In the beginning, everyone used the power of the Weave to cast spells. Even if there was a gap in intelligence, the difference was only the number of spell slots mastered and the speed of learning spells. It was not a very obvious benchmark. Now that the Weave had disappeared, most of the geniuses stood out, and these people had become the key to many forces. Even the city of Mordor had 2 or 3 witches with innate intelligence above 20. These people were all accepted as apprentices by Gloria, ready to train them into future arcanists. At this time, in the council hall of Mordor City, Soren, Gloria, Saruman, Fallen Witch and others sat together. What? Gloria froze for a moment after hearing Soren's words. She then murmured, "You mean? Are you going to open a school in Mordor? Not an aristocratic school? Is it a completely universal school?" As soon as Gloria's voice fell, everyone else's expression was a little surprised. The level of knowledge in this world was very low. It belonged to the most standard elite education model. Knowledge was always in the hands of the upper echelons of society. Ordinary civilians would find it difficult to even be literate. Some people could barely write their own names in their entire lives. Only merchants, nobles and professionals could grasp more knowledge. In fact, many commoners joined the churches of the gods because the churches would also impart knowledge to the commoners. Yes, Soren had wanted to do this for a long time, but now he felt that the time was right. He looked at the others and said in a deep voice, "I'm going to open a school." Because of the collapse of the magic network, the number of spellcasters in Mordor City has suddenly increased. In the past, there were not so many scholars to impart knowledge in Mordor City, but now there are so many wizards in Mordor City. Even if many spellcasters are not strong, the knowledge they have accumulated is very valuable. Mordor City needs a lot of talents in the future. Not only talents with the potential to become wizards, but also talents in other aspects. I'm going to try a new model. You can call it assembly line production. Let those ordinary people who are not talented enough master a certain part of a certain job. Through repeated practice they will become more proficient. Finally, the whole process will be composed of different divisions of labor. The knowledge of wizards was far beyond other professions. Today there were many low-grade wizards in Mordor City. They retained less than 30% of their spellcasting ability, but the knowledge accumulated in the past did not disappear. If he didn't use them, would Soren raise them for nothing? As long as they took turns teaching, even if a person only taught for one day in a week, it was enough to teach ordinary people a lot of things. Alchemy was not all done by spells. The factory of the magic network puppet also needed a lot of low-level labor, including polishing the parts of the golems, assembling the structure of the golems, arranging the rune routes, and so on. These parts could be done by ordinary people. If a production line could be formed, then wizards only needed to be responsible for the most important activation and charging parts. I'm not going to open a school for nobles. Soren saw that the others still didn't understand, so he slowly explained, in short, you can think of it as a technical school. Except for the simplest knowledge of words, all the other categories are to learn some kind of technology. Such a school doesn't take too long to specialize. It will take a few months to a year or so. The students there can master one kind of technology, and then directly go to work in various positions in Mordor City. In this way, even ordinary families in Mordor City can afford it. Why was the prevalence of knowledge in the material plane so low? To a large extent, it was because ordinary families simply couldn't afford a labor force that could not bring any income to the family. That was why knowledge would circulate among merchants and noble families. What Soren wanted to do was to shorten this cycle. At present, Mordor City was under rapid construction, and low-end labor had gradually been replaced by golems. What he needed now was more technical labor. In this way, opening a technical school had become a very important part. A technical school with a learning period of half a year to a year could provide a steady stream of low-end and middle-end talents with a mastery of water conservancy, forging, engineering, alchemy, and other professions for Mordor. It was even more straightforward. At present, Mordor City no longer needed coolies. What Soren needed were workers. That's right. Workers, workers, workers. Important things must be said 3 times. The purpose of Soren's school was to train workers to meet the needs of a large number of low-end technical labor in the floating city in the future. Speaking of this, Soren paused, then looked at Saruman in front of him and said in a deep voice, regarding alchemy technology, everyone has seen the results of your research. So, I'll arrange for someone to do the specific construction of the school, but you'll still be the dean. If it's a preliminary plan, I'm going to recruit about 3,000 students from Mordor City. After graduation, these people will go directly to work in the arsenal, laboratory, and city hall of Mordor City. Gloria needed to be responsible for studying the floating space tower, Fallen Witch's focus was on the elemental furnace, and Alice was responsible for the golem factory. Soren naturally couldn't manage the school himself. So at present, the only person in Mordor City who had the energy to be the dean was probably Saruman, who was only in charge of an alchemy laboratory. Training workers was only the most basic plan. If this academy could really be set up, Soren would have even more talents to cultivate in the future. The professional academy had long been one of his ideas. Otherwise, there would be too many things to consider and the investment would be too great. He had already begun to plan for it. Some things must be considered in the current actual situation. Taking the residents of Mordor City as the standard, the family support to train a skilled worker was already the limit. It couldn't be helped. The foundation of the material plane was still too low. The whole thing was just the productivity at the end of the Middle Ages. Soren wanted to directly promote the education model of the modern period, which would probably require Mordor City to bear a considerable part of the financial expenses. A conservative estimate of hundreds of thousands of Kindler was indispensable. At present, he only hoped to see results as soon as possible. P.S. The first update. Today is the 3rd update. Chapter 860. Mordor City. Hammerstone Tavern. As a newly built tavern, the Hammerstone Tavern was not very lively, far less than other high-end taverns in Port Mordor. However, there was also a benefit of the tavern here, there were regular customers from military camps and munitions factories. Especially the Grey Dwarves of Mordor City, they liked the high-alcohol liquor here very much. Compared with other taverns, the Hammerstone Tavern was cheap. The wine glass was the size of a clay bowl, so most of the guests here were from the middle and lower levels of Mordor City. Today there were a lot of guests in the Hammerstone Tavern. However, unlike the bustle of the past, today's Hammerstone Tavern was full of whispers. Have you heard? The higher-ups are going to set up an academy. I heard that there are no requirements for admission. As long as you have a Mordor residence permit, you can enter. And you don't need to pay any tuition. I heard that the great Soren is going to let those noble wizards be teachers in person. Not knowing when it started, Soren in Mordor City was no longer just called Soren, sir. More and more people began to use the word great to describe Soren's achievements. Because all these changes were closely related to their lives, the lower-class civilians were actually very easy to be satisfied. They would remember who made their lives better and better. I know. I just heard about it today. A bearded man took a sip of wine and said, "The city hall revealed the news early in the morning. But it's not all wizards. The city hall is recruiting other scholars and craftsmen as teachers. It is said that the Mordor Academy specializes in teaching some skills. But it's not completely free. The academy has fees, but if your family is in trouble, you don't have to pay first. After graduation, these tuition fees can be slowly paid off through work. As long as you can work in Mordor City, you can pay off the tuition fees in half a year at most." As a primitive era. At present, the material plane was still implementing the apprenticeship system, which was similar to ancient China. Even an ordinary craftsman apprentice would need 3 to 5 years to complete their apprenticeship, and during this period they would be free labor. In this era, a good craftsmanship could support a person for a lifetime. The ceremony of apprenticeship was very complicated in all aspects. It was also very common for apprentices to be beaten and scolded. Sometimes, if they met a bad master, it could take them more than 10 years to earn a living. Although Soren did not open a professional college, the current system in Mordor City was already changing the rules of reality. It could be said that as long as this academy system was established, the simple and primitive apprenticeship system in other places in the material plane would basically disappear from Mordor City, and the cultivation of talents would be more efficient. I know. The other man continued, "My nephew is about the same age. I've always wanted him to be a sailor, but he doesn't like drifting on the sea. I'm going to let him go in and learn something. I can also have an official job in Mordor City in the future. It's good that he can learn some useful skills at his age." Not everyone was qualified to be a professional. And being a professional was not as good as ordinary people thought, because professionals had to face more dangers. Many parents still wanted their children to live an ordinary life, not to join the army or drift on the sea. Mordor City now provided a lot of job opportunities, but there were very few capable people. Most of them were low-end coolies who sold labor. They used to be useful, but now there were more and more golems in Mordor City. These simple labor could be replaced by golems. At present, Mordor City needed more skilled talents. Yeah, I think so too. I'm going to send my son to learn how to build a ship. Mordor City is overseas. If you know how to build a ship, you don't have to worry about not having enough food to eat. I just don't know what Mordor City is going to teach at present. This time it was a tall and thin man who answered. But a man who looked like a patrol sergeant sitting behind them said in a low voice, "Not only that. I heard that Mordor City is going to select talents from the whole city who have the qualifications to become wizards and other professions this time. If your nephew can pass the test. Tisk tisk hey. That's great. They will definitely be the new rich of Mordor City in the future." Hearing this person's words, several other people could not help but be startled. Then they said in surprise, "Really?" Although the magic network had collapsed. But for ordinary people, wizards were still a high existence. Just look at the wizard Soren first faced in Amber City. In the eyes of ordinary people, wizards were almost the same as nobles. If someone in the nephew's generation could really become a wizard, then the status of the whole family could be improved in a straight line, and the future would definitely be much brighter. I still have a few nephews in Shipwreck Bay. Do you want to bring them here? It doesn't matter if they have talent or not. It won't take much time to go back and forth anyway. It was not a trivial matter to have a wizard in a family. In the past, most of the wizards were passed down internally. Very few people would spend a lot of effort to choose from ordinary people. Because becoming a wizard required knowledge as a foundation. A person who didn't even know how to read, even if they had high intelligence, could not learn spells at all. So in the past, there was no lack of people with wizard talent who were buried. Now that the magic network had collapsed, there was a very clear standard to measure. That was, if the innate intelligence did not reach more than 18 points, they would not be able to brew a trace of mana at all. In this way it would be much easier to select the top talents, There was a lot of discussion in the tavern. However, the most talked about topic was the recently established Mordor Academy. No matter what it was like inside, Soren's every move had already involved the thoughts of everyone in Mordor City. Everything that Soren had done in the past had already proved himself. The lower-class civilians were almost blind to Soren. When they heard that Soren was going to establish the academy, they immediately thought that it was a very promising thing. So now many people in Mordor City were preparing to send their younger generation to the academy. Even if they did not have a son, they wanted to send the talented and smart people and their relatives. Invisibly, the most promising group of newcomers in Mordor City gathered together with Soren's words. How many talents could be born in the future? How stable the foundation of Mordor City would be. P.S. The second update. There is another update today. Chapter 861. The wind was howling. Accompanied by a violent tremor, the broken wall in front of them collapsed with a loud bang. Then, a tall mutated lizard man appeared in front of everyone, and a petite figure was wandering around it. This petite figure was so agile that only afterimages could be seen when she moved, but when she attacked they could still vaguely hear a cat-like figure. Lulu. Stop playing. The high priest stood calmly not far away. After a glance he slowly said, "Get rid of this guy. Let's continue to look for the entrance to the anti-magic prison." Meow. The petite figure landed on the ground and nodded. The next moment, 3 cold lights appeared. A terrible wound appeared on the lizardman's chest, and then it fell to the ground. If one looked carefully, one could see that a sharp blade had pierced its heart. Lulu's strength has improved very quickly. A pretty girl in a white priest robe walked out. She stroked Lulu's head lovingly and pinched her furry ears. "So cute," she said with a smile. Lulu didn't seem to like being pinched. She hid behind the high priest, looked at her and whispered, "Sister Milan's progress is really scary. Now she can use legendary divine spells." As she grew older, Lulu gradually began to show more characteristics of a werbeast. She had another combat form. After transforming into a werbeast, she would show a pair of sharp canine teeth. As a feline werbeast, Lulu's combat talent was very similar to that of a feline. It could be said that fighting was one of her instincts. Lulu received the training of an assassin like the drows. With the talent of a feline she was a little bit successful. She's a saint priest. She's not the same as ordinary mortals. The high priest glanced at Milan. Facing the calm eyes of the high priest, Milan was obviously a lot more cautious. Then the high priest slowly said, "Although the purpose of this trip is to explore the pirate island, it's also one of the tasks to train your ability so that you can enter the realm of legends as soon as possible. Don't be careless. According to my senses, there should be a lot of dangerous creatures nearby." There weren't many dangerous creatures on Pirate Island. After entering the island, the high priest split up the team. Because the island was too big, they had to spread out in order to gather information as quickly as possible. Lulu and Milan were in her team. The other team was made up of Ugly Monkey and Giant. Because of the high priest's psychic field, there was no need to worry about communication issues. If anything happened, the other team could immediately rush over to help. As a top-notch spirit warlock, the high priest's ability was even more useful than the technology of the interstellar era. "High priest, we found a group of shark men." At this moment, Ugly Monkey's voice rang out in the psychic field. He seemed to be a little excited as he said, "We found a passage near the northern coast of the island. But the road has already sunk. I suspect that this is the entrance to the anti-magic prison." Anti-magic prison. This was the most important purpose of their trip. For Soren, the wealth of the pirate island was not important. There were many ways to make money in Mordor, but the alchemy technology in the prison was very important, especially the use and development of the magic lock. "Don't go in. The anti-magic prison is definitely more dangerous than you think. Wait for us to come over." Hearing this, the high priest was shocked and immediately said, "I have confirmed your coordinates. We will be there in about 15 minutes. Pay attention to those sharkmen, don't disturb them easily." This island had been occupied by mutated creatures. Most of the creatures seen so far were marine species and amphibious creatures. Because of the high energy radiation, the monsters here were very powerful. It was difficult to see creatures below the higher grade. However, because of the high energy radiation, the minds of these creatures were a little crazy. They were like crazy and bloodthirsty primitive creatures, and some of their characteristics were even like demons. They were full of aggression. This was similar to the indigenous people. Because of the energy radiation, the indigenous people in the outer islands were more irritable by nature. Compared to other species, they were very aggressive and violent. The high energy radiation would cause problems for the creatures. This was the same for the elementals because a group of angry wind elementals appeared in the Amazon tropical forest because of the divine power of the Storm Lord. At present, the Amazon female warriors were annoyed by these wind elementals. The high priest and the others rushed over. When they arrived, the drows had already followed. In front of them was a group of shark men with amazing physiques. Unlike other shark men, the eyes of these shark men were red. They were entrenched near the coast, and a group of underwater buildings could be seen. This was their lair. Inside the lair, there was a passage that led directly to a crack in the bottom of the sea. At present, it was uncertain whether it was the entrance to the anti-magic prison. During the Great Catastrophe, there were violent earthquakes here. The Arcane Empire not only dabbled in the field of souls, but even the magnetic field inside the plane was also within their scope of research. During the Great Catastrophe, the chain-type collapse directly caused the energy magnetic field to become chaotic. Then there were many earthquakes inside the entire material plane. Some directly caused a small piece of land to split from it and then sink into the sea. The anti-magic prison was currently not visible on land. The biggest possibility was that it had sunk to the bottom of the sea because of the earthquake. "Do you want to kill them all first?" The giant's dull voice sounded, and he seemed to be eager to try. The high priest shook his head gently and said slowly, "There's no need to kill them all. Leave the priests inside for me to interrogate. There should be something useful." Hearing the high priest's words, the giant smiled and licked his lips. Then he carried the huge and heavy anchor and walked forward. After this period of battle, the group of people had gradually gotten used to each other. The giant was a very qualified meat shield. Not only was his skin thick, but he was also tall and strong. He was first class in attracting hatred. Although there was no legendary wizard because there was a level 30 psionic warlock, they might be more powerful than other legendary teams in a real battle. Because the high priest's psionic force field was already a kind of domain-type power, even in a battle they could communicate instantly without any delay. Unless someone's ability was stronger than her and could interfere or break the psionic force field, otherwise, they were almost invincible in a battle of the same level. PS, third update. The public WeChat advertising girl has been restored. Everyone can tease her when you have time. Chapter 862. The giant steadily advanced forward. Because of his special bloodline, Giant had chosen armored skin and epic strengthening as he advanced into the realm of legends. In theory, according to the natural growth of the HP of the giant species, which was higher than other species, and the HP bonus of the giant semi-purebred warrior, his total HP should be a little higher than Soren's. As a god, Soren's HP was close to that of a giant dragon's. Similarly, the giant's HP and strength were close to that of a giant dragon's. At this moment, the giant was like a city wall, successfully blocking the enemy's attack and keeping everyone outside the ship's anchor. With a good enough meat shield, the battle would be half won. Ugly Monkey and Lulu wandered around the giant, killing the injured sharkmen from time to time. As for the high priestess, she didn't make a move at all. Only the saint priestess, Miran, would cast some healing and buff spells from time to time. The drow warriors guarded the flanks. They did not join the battle directly, but scattered to block the enemy's retreat. The battle did not last long. These sharkmen were quickly defeated. A small portion of them abandoned their homes and fled into the sea, while the rest were captured. High priest. The giant carried a 2-meter-tall shark man like a chicken and threw him in front of the high priest. "This is the shaman you wanted. It's still alive." At this point, Giant pointed at the half-dead shark man on the ground and smiled embarrassedly. These sharkmen were too weak. It had almost squashed one of them to death by accident. As a giant warrior, its strength had increased at an astonishing speed after breaking through the legendary realm. It had already surpassed most of the swamp giants. The high priest gestured to Milan, the saint necromancer beside him, to cast a healing divine spell. Then, a trace of psionic radiance appeared in his eyes, directly controlling the spiritual will of the shark man in front of him. The high priestess was a level 30 psionic warlock. She alone was enough to eliminate these monsters because no one was immune to her mind control. If it wasn't for Soren, her stage would have been in the wider astral plane. The material plane was already too small for her. After a while, the high priest released the control on the shark man and said calmly, "Found it? It's in the underwater canyon ahead." But the shark man said that there are very scary monsters inside. Get ready. We'll go down in the afternoon to see what's going on. Mordor City, Council Hall. The Mordor Academy was progressing in an orderly manner. When Soren proposed to let the wizards in Mordor City teach the students, they had no choice but to agree. There was only one day of class a week, so it wouldn't affect the wizards' time. As a teacher of Mordor College, they would also contribute. The city of Mordor would give them a corresponding rating according to the excellent students they taught. These contributions and ratings could be used to enter the big library of Mordor City, and the upper level of the library preserved a lot of spells and knowledge from the Arcane Empire. In a place south of the central square. At this time, a huge new building was being built. This was the expanded library of Mordor City. There were about 30,000 books stored in it, including astronomy, geography, history, literature, arcana, and so on. Most of the books were the private collections of Gloria and the Fallen Witch, and some were things that Soren found outside. Some books in the Arcane Tower were also transferred to the upper level of the library. In addition, there was an exhibition hall in the big library, where all kinds of cultural relics and antiques were placed. Soren made a relatively tight division in the library's authority. For example, the spell, Melf's Minute Meteor, could not be read in the big library without the corresponding authority and contribution. In order to encourage the wizards here to contribute more to Mordor City, Soren even put Time Stop, Banshee's Howl, Greater Chain of Accidents, and so on, including some supreme magic skills within the library's authority. It was just that it was more difficult to see them. To deal with wizards, you couldn't just attract them with money. Wizards were relatively rich. Even if their strength was greatly reduced now, many of them were not interested in money at all. The best way to attract wizards was to give them spells and knowledge that they didn't know so that they would be willing to work. At present, the library of Mordor City saved most of the wizard's spells from the first circle to the 9th circle, and it also included several legendary spells as well as legendary level supreme magic skills. Soren even included the process of making legendary thaling. As long as they reached the contribution point, they could learn it. This was also the reason why the wizards were willing to cooperate with Mordor Academy. Without these benefits in front of them, these wizards would definitely not be willing to contribute. In terms of the accumulation of arcana, Mordor City's foundation was still good. At present, there were 3 legendary wizards in Mordor City, namely Gloria, Fallen Witch, and Alice. Although Mordor City had risen not long ago, in fact even in the Wizard Alliance, there were only 7 or 8 people who had advanced to become great wizards. There were even fewer legendary wizards in the Northern Witch Council. Except for Eye of the North, most of them were ordinary legendary wizards, and there were only 5 or 6 of them. The number of legendary spellcasters was very small. It was more difficult for them to break through the realm of legends than other professions. Most of the wizards stopped at the high grade, and then were forced to transform into liches or other creatures, relying on time to slowly become legendary spellcasters. For this kind of people, as long as they transformed into liches and did not die after hundreds of years, there would always be a time to advance to the legendary realm. Soren finalized the overall structure of Mordor City. Then he appointed Saruman as the Dean of Mordor Academy. As a new high-grade wizard, Saruman had divinity, and his strength would not be much worse than an ordinary legendary wizard. And Soren also needed to cultivate his management skills, because if he was promoted to a god in the future, Saruman would need to manage a church. In the blink of an eye, it was afternoon. When Soren finalized the basic structure of Mordor Academy, he was ready to see the progress of Gloria's research. However, at this moment he suddenly received a message from the High Priest for help. Anti-magic prison. Soren's mind suddenly reacted, and the next moment he directly opened the portal. Chapter 863. The anti-magic prison was a very dangerous place. Its difficulty was still within the range of the High Priest, but it was far beyond the endurance of the rest of the team. Soren prepared 2 backup plans at the beginning. The first backup plan was that if the enemy was not too strong, then Soren would descend on the St. Cardinal Milan as a god. The second plan was to deal with a very dangerous enemy. If the High Priest personally led the team and still couldn't defeat the enemy, then the High Priest would send a signal for help to Soren himself. Then Soren would use the High Priest as a teleportation guide to directly reach the battlefield. Soren received the signal for the second situation. The enemy was beyond the range of the High Priest, and the rest of the team were even in danger. The whole team was composed of the elite forces of Motor City. The loss of any one of them was very serious for Soren, so he did not hesitate and directly opened the portal with his divine power. The next moment, Soren's figure appeared in the deep sea. Soren was a little unaccustomed to suddenly coming to the sea, but as a god, his ability to adapt to the environment was very strong. Soon he was as flexible as he was on land. Next to him was the high priest who acted as a teleportation guide. At this moment the rest of the team was quite embarrassed, especially the giant who acted as a meat shield. He even lost an arm. "What's the situation?" Soren frowned and glanced at the others present, and said in a deep voice, "What kind of monster did you encounter?" He waved his hand. With the appearance of the divine light, Soren directly healed the giant's injury with greater restoration, and then he saw that the broken arm was regenerating at a speed visible to the naked eye. As a high and mighty god, although Soren's strength had been greatly reduced because of the Avatar crisis and there was no way for him to cast resurrection at present, if it was only a physical injury and he was not dead, then he could save them in the blink of an eye. Even if he was cut in half there would be no problem. The son of Dagon. The high priest also looked a little tired at this moment and slowly said, "My lord, there is a real son of Dagon below. It has a very strong spiritual force. All the devil fish in this area are under its control." The real son of Dagon? Soren understood the gist of the situation. He frowned and said, "I'll go down and take a look. Follow me carefully." He had once encountered the son of Dagon. However, that was an existence that belonged to the inferior class, and could not be considered the true son of Dagon. Because the son of Dagon only inherited Dagon's bloodline and physique, he did not use many of the special abilities of the Orbis demons back then. Otherwise, it was almost impossible for them to win that battle because Dagon was best at chaotic battles and group battles. Since the high priest mentioned that he was the real son of Dagon, then the demons below him must have inherited a lot of power. Dagon had many children. As the most powerful aquatic demon lord, Dagon was an existence that could not be ignored in the ocean domain. His descendants were spread across many oceans in the multiverse, even near the Nether River. However, those places were much more dangerous. Some of the sons of Dagon had even reached the strength of a secondary demon lord, and the one in front of him was probably about the same level. Since the high priest was afraid of it, then it must have the power of a domain. The seawater was shrouded in a violent arcane energy. Soren was sure that the anti-magic prison was below because such strong energy radiation could only be produced in very few places. As Soren continued to go deeper, the devil fish began to appear around him. He did not see the son of Dagon yet, but he sensed a dangerous aura through the gods. The next moment, a row of data appeared in front of Soren's eyes. "You have entered the chaos domain. You are affected by the son of Dagon's chaos domain. All your tests of resistance have been affected by -2 negative status." It was indeed the son of Dagon who had a domain. At this time, Soren also saw a huge shadow entrenched in the depths of the underwater canyon. It had discovered Soren. Then another row of data appeared. "You are affected by the son of Dagon's nightmare spell. Test of resistance triggered. Test of resistance passed. You are immune to the spell's effects. You are affected by the son of Dagon's enchanting curse spell. Test of resistance triggered. Test of resistance passed. You are immune to the spell's effects. You are affected by the son of Dagon's enchanting insignia spell. Test of will triggered. Test of resistance passed. You are immune to the spell's effects." A bunch of spell immunity data popped up. Soren could not help but frown. No wonder the high priest and the others could not defeat it. With the strength of the son of Dagon in front of him, perhaps other than the high priest, no one could be completely immune to so many control spells after entering the range of the chaos domain. All the control spells were ineffective. The son of Dagon seemed to have realized that Soren was stronger than any enemy it had ever encountered. Then it made a strange sound and a large group of devilfish emerged from the underwater canyon. There were probably hundreds of them and all of them rushed towards Soren. "Go away." Soren looked at the black mass of devilfish. In an instant, a golden light appeared in his eyes, and then he roared towards the front. Intimidation. Divine power conversion. Soren's roar formed a wave on the bottom of the sea, and then all the devilfish that rushed towards him trembled. Then, as if they had seen something extremely terrifying, they directly fled in all directions. Intimidation was successful. Soren's basic skill intimidation was as high as 575 points, which meant that he could directly rely on his own aura to disperse all the creatures below legendary. If one were to use data to describe it, it would be that the large group of devilfish in front of him directly turned from red to yellow because of Soren's intimidation. All the deep-sea monsters controlled by the son of Dagon were directly stunned by Soren's roar. The idea of relying on numbers to deplete Soren's strength failed, and the son of Dagon launched an attack on him in the next moment. Suddenly, huge tentacles emerged from the depths of the underwater canyon and entangled Soren from all directions. Strangle? Facing the ferocious tentacles, Soren rushed over with no expression. With a strange silver-white stream of light, all the tentacles were directly cut off wherever his figure went. Now he was no longer as strong as he was in the past. As an intermediate divine power god, and with a divine artifact in hand, even against an enemy like the son of Dagon, Soren could completely crush it. Chapter 864. The thick smell of blood permeated the seawater. Facing Soren, who was closing in, the son of Dagon was obviously panicking. As the descendant of the demon Orbis, the son of Dagon's most powerful weapon was its own body. Now that its body was powerless in front of Soren's divine artifact, the son of Dagon could only place its hopes on its innate ability as the demon Orbis. Along with a sharp roar, a strong spiritual attack was launched at Soren. Soren frowned slightly and waved his hand. Immediately, a divine barrier appeared in front of him. The seawater began to ripple violently. The spiritual attack of the son of Dagon could not shake Soren's divine barrier at all. In the next moment, Soren's figure flew out. A silver-white stream of light cut through the silent seabed. Soren directly attacked the son of Dagon from the front. Relying on his powerful divine artifact, he directly broke through all the tentacles. Then he waved his sharp blade and pierced into the son of Dagon's head. A row of data appeared in front of him. Son of Dagon, killed. Extracting target's soul energy. You've received 3650000 slaughter EXP. Target has divine power. Extracting target's divine power. You've received 8 divine power. Little by little, the light of divine power merged into Soren's body. The son of Dagon had a lot of divine power. Although such an existence was powerful, it did not have a single divinity. What Soren needed the most at the moment was not divine power, but divinity to further stabilize his strength. Compared to the divine power that was becoming more and more common, divinity could only be obtained from special enemies. Now that Soren's divine power was as high as 230 points, it was more than twice the amount of divinity. For Soren, leveling up to greater divinity was not a problem. However, gathering enough divinity to level up to greater divinity was very difficult. He had to continue killing gods. And it had to be a god with intermediate divine power or above. Otherwise, he could only rely on large numbers to make up for it. Plop. Huge tentacles with a diameter of more than 3 meters fell to the bottom of the sea. Filthy demon blood seeped out from the body of the son of Dagon. The blood had a trace of fierce corrosiveness, and the nearby seabed plants withered. Dispel. Purify. A golden light of divinity appeared in Soren's palm, and the evil power that was polluting the seawater was purified by him. The son of Dagon occupied the entrance to the anti-magic prison. With its huge body, it was difficult to enter, so it occupied the place with the strongest radiation. Soren frowned as he stared at the huge corpse in front of him. He then cast a spell and forcefully moved the corpse away. A deep entrance appeared in front of him. This should be one of the important strongholds of the anti-magic prison. This was because Soren could feel a very strong energy radiation. It was probably as strong as when he found the elemental furnace last time. My lord. The figure of the high priestess also appeared behind Soren. Her eyes were full of awe at the moment because the son of Dagon, who blocked them outside, was so easily killed by Soren. Soren looked back at her, then glanced at the other members of the team and said, "You arrange for others to cut up the body of the son of Dagon and bring it up. Gloria and Karina's experimental research should be useful. High priestess. Milan. Giant. The 3 of you come with me into the anti-magic prison." The son of Dagon weighed more than hundreds of tons, and it was not easy to transport it up. Soren only took 4 people into the anti-magic prison because they were the only ones whose strength could be stable above the legendary level. They did not know what kind of monsters were inside the anti-magic prison. People who were not at the legendary level would die if they went in. Yes. The high priestess quickly followed the order and arranged for people to cut up and transport the body of the son of Dagon. The strength of the son of Dagon, who was killed by Soren, was equivalent to the strength of a lesser demon lord. It was similar to his demon incarnation, Sauron. There were many rare treasures on it. Light. A little bit of light appeared in Soren's palm. As the group entered the anti-magic prison, everything in front of them became clear. As an underground ruin sunk to the bottom of the sea, the interior of the anti-magic prison was very damaged. Soren could see many dilapidated buildings, most of which had collapsed. They had only moved forward a few hundred meters when they were blocked by a collapsed wall in front of them. Stone to mud. Soren waved his hand and cast a spell. Then he reached out and touched the wall gently. The wall in front of him turned into mud and scattered. A huge lavender crystal appeared in front of them. Soren had seen such a crystal in the ruins of the Battle of the Golems. He knew that he had entered the interior of the anti-magic prison. Rooms began to appear in front of them. There were many glass crystals. More than 90% of them were damaged. There were also incomplete bookshelves. The books in them were basically gone. Seawater covered the entire anti-magic prison. There was almost nothing intact. Soren walked around several rooms. Suddenly he seemed to feel something and walked toward one of the halls. A huge metal construct appeared in front of him. Elemental furnace? No. Soren glanced at it and was quite surprised. He murmured, "It's not like an elemental furnace. The energy radiation is all emitted from it. This is not an elemental furnace. It looks like a device for elemental fission." Soren's research on alchemy was not enough. He had to find a way to transport this thing back to Mordor and give it to Gloria to study. Alert. Alert. Intruder found. Activate Arcane Guardian. Destroy the intruder. There was a sharp metal sound and then one of the doors opened. Soren almost instantly entered battle mode. He waited for a while but still did not see the figure of Arcane Guardian. Soren thought for a while and carefully approached the door. Then he saw a puppet golem that had been buried underground for a long time. There was a red arcane glow on its body, but most of its body had been broken. This was the bottom of the sea and not on land. There were very few things in the entire anti-magic prison that could function normally. Where is the magic lock? Soren walked around the ruins and frowned. Under normal circumstances, a place like the anti-magic prison must have a magic lock. So where is the core of the magic lock? Is it because it's not activated? Soren walked through the rooms one by one and saw many strange devices, but most of them had failed. On the way he also encountered a few guardian golems that could still function, but they were easily taken care of by him. After confirming that there were no dangerous enemies in the entire underground ruins, Soren prepared to return to the pirate island. A teleportation circle would soon be built here, and then the manpower and material resources of Mordor City would be invested in it. Most of the devices in the anti-magic prison would be transported back to Mordor City. Perhaps only Fallen Witch and Gloria could distinguish which ones were related to the magic lock. Chapter 865. The preliminary cleaning of the anti-magic prison was completed. Soren brought a small part of the intact alchemy runes to the land. He did not rush back to Motor City but waited for Gloria's arrival. Gloria arrived by teleportation around dusk. Fallen Witch was half an hour later than her, and Roland did not know why she was delayed, but her expression seemed a bit strange today. Unlike Soren who looked at the pile of alchemy runes, Gloria and Fallen Witch couldn't help but be surprised when they saw these things. They carefully took it apart and studied it. At the same time, they instructed the apprentices beside them to constantly record something. In their eyes, this pile of severely damaged equipment was like an incredible treasure. Even some of the fine rune engravings on it were carefully copied down. Okay. Soren had to admit that he was not a pure scholar, and he could not understand the runes on these alchemy runes at all. As if knowing Soren's doubts, Gloria took time to look at him, gently lifted her long hair and said, "According to the degree of damage of these alchemy devices, we can basically be sure that the magic lock has been closed. The energy supply devices are all damaged. The magic lock only relies on self-replenishing energy to maintain operation for at most 100 years, and this place has been buried for thousands of years. The core of the magic lock should be silent somewhere on the bottom of the sea. Next, we need a lot of manpower to salvage it. According to the preliminary judgment, there will be a complete magic lock below, and it will be very large, larger than the magic lock of the arcane tower. The range of the magic lock is estimated to cover half of the island of Motor. The anti-magic prison was an island. The magic lock here was naturally larger than that of an ordinary arcane tower. Gloria judged the range of the magic lock according to the number of alchemy devices, and the next salvage would be in this range. Fallen, which next to her was not interested in the magic lock. She was studying devices similar to elemental fission. It's a bit different from elemental furnace. Fallen, which looked at the crystal rune in front of her and murmured, "But the energy supply must be larger. This thing needs to be repaired before we can confirm whether it's an elemental fission device." The anti-magic prison required a large amount of energy. This was a very special place where many evil arcanists had been imprisoned. In order to maintain the seal on them, the magic lock had to be operated at full power. Therefore, the energy supply device must be very advanced, probably as much as the energy consumption of a floating city. Since all of you are here, then I'll leave this side to you. I'll go back and send more people over. Soren was bored after watching for a while. He could learn spells, but calmly studying such a complicated alchemy rune wasn't his style. Fortunately, Gloria and Fallen, which were experts in this field. Now that they had arrived in Soren, there was no need for Mordor to stay here. Gloria, who had been immersed in researching new things, had no objections to this. What she wanted to do the most right now was to move everything from the anti-magic prison up. As soon as he returned to Mordor City, Soren seemed to have noticed something. The next moment, his figure appeared directly in Vivian's room. During this time, Vivian had been integrating the power of divinity given by Soren. It was very difficult for a native to become a demigod. It was not something that could be achieved in a short period of time. Soren's speed of integrating divinity and divinity was like cheating even for a god. At this moment, a trace of pain appeared on Vivian's delicate little face. Her whole body was suspended in midair, and the dissipating power of fear formed a barrier, isolating the surrounding space. Vivian's body was changing. From the bloodline of the deity to the bloodline of the demigod. But just as she was about to succeed, a little accident happened. The will of the Dreadlord came. At this time, in Soren's eyes, Vivian's figure was suspended in midair, and behind her was a ferocious shadow of the Dreadlord. This shadow could not be seen by the naked eye, but for Soren, who was in the form of a god, he could perceive any trace of spiritual will and special existence on the soul. The Dreadlord finally couldn't hold it in anymore. Just when Vivian was about to integrate the power of divinity and become a demigod, he launched an attack on Vivian, trying to invade her mind and seize control of her body. This was a seed that was engraved on the soul. It had been left as early as the moment Vivian was born. Even Soren had no way to erase it. If the Dreadlord succeeded, then Vivian would disappear completely, and the Dreadlord would be reborn in her body. Not only could he take back his divinity and divine power, but he could also absorb Vivian's power. Finally can't take it anymore? A cold murderous intent appeared in Soren's eyes. Without hesitation, he reached out his finger and gently touched Vivian's forehead. The Dreadlord was dead. His remaining divine power was not enough for a direct resurrection, so he could only attack Vivian at the most critical moment, trying to destroy Vivian's spiritual will in one fell swoop. This mark was left on her mind and soul. Soren instantly realized the Dreadlord's plot. The next moment he activated his divine form and directly entered the spiritual space where Vivian's soul was trapped. Time froze at this moment. Vivian's painful expression seemed to have disappeared, and a surprised smile appeared on her delicate little face. At this time, a ray of light appeared on Soren's body. A little bit of divine light merged into Vivian's body and turned into an invisible shadow that directly entered Vivian's body. Soren directly invaded the world where the Dreadlord was trying to trap Vivian in his spiritual form. The wind was howling. The whole world was gray, and a gloomy atmosphere shrouded everything, inexplicably making people feel a sense of panic. In the center of the whole world was a huge throne. Countless demons gathered around the throne, but none of them dared to approach it. Big brother. Big brother. At this time, a ray of golden light suddenly appeared in the sky, and then a shadow shrouded in divine light directly fell on the throne. The shadow gradually turned into a solid body, and Soren's figure appeared in the center of the throne. At this moment he looked as if he was facing a great enemy, but the next moment he was stunned. This was because he saw two identical Vivians on this throne that was constructed purely out of divine power. What the hell? What's going on? Why are there two identical Vivian in the spiritual world? At this moment, Soren suddenly became a little confused, because in the eyes of the gods, the two Vivian souls were the same. Chapter 866. The sky was gray. This world seemed to be shrouded by some kind of power. Even Soren felt a sense of oppression and fear after he arrived. However, this feeling only existed for a short while. Soon, Soren's firm will had resisted all the negative effects. He glanced around and saw countless demons and petitioners. Then he roughly guessed where he was. This should be the place where the soul of the Dreadlord was kept. It was also the throne of fear, in the kingdom of fear in the bottomless abyss. All of this happened in an instant. Although Soren was surprised by the two Vivian's appearance, his long-term adventure still made him habitually understand the surrounding environment. Vivian was a smart girl. If it weren't for the limitations of being a native, her talent would probably be higher than Soren's. This was not only because she was better in a certain aspect, but also because she had an advantage in all aspects including IQ. Even Soren had to admit this because when he was Vivian's age, his performance was far inferior to hers. The little girl was barely 11 years old this year. Soren's expression did not escape the little girl's eyes. Then the two girls in front of him looked at each other. Vivian, who was standing on the left, bowed slightly to Soren. She twirled her skirt and bowed slightly. Then she said softly, "Brother." "Hello. I'm Lillian." Lillian? The Witch of Fear, Lillian? She had existed for a long time? This sentence shocked Soren like thunder. But then he seemed to have understood something. He immediately looked at Vivian and frowned. "Vivian, what's going on? Has Lillian already awakened in your body?" "Yes. When we were in Glorious Tower, you called yourself Lillian. So, you've been hiding it from me all this time?" Soren already had a vague guess in his heart. However, Vivian's usual behavior was normal, so he was only slightly suspicious. Today he actually saw two Vivians. His suspicions in the past immediately had a basis, and he quickly understood the general situation of the matter. "Brother, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hide it, but..." Vivian, who was standing on the right, had a guilty look on her face. She opened her mouth a few times but she didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell Soren the truth several times, but she didn't know what to say. "Forget it." Seeing the little girl's conflicted look, Soren's heart softened. He shook his head and said, "Now is not the time to talk about this. The will of the Dreadlord is still watching us. The most important thing now is to get you out of here." Having said that, Soren turned around and looked at Lillian beside him. He was a little unaccustomed to the fact that they looked exactly the same, but he quickly recovered and asked calmly, "When did you start to have self-awareness?" "Self-awareness?" Hearing Soren's words, Lillian, who was standing on the left, was startled. She then whispered, "Brother?" "I started to have self-awareness when Vivian was born. It's just that the memory at that time was very vague. I only started to understand when Vivian was 3 years old. But when I really woke up, it was after the appearance of the other children of fear." The little girl was very smart. Lillian obviously guessed what Soren wanted to ask. Two souls in one body? Soren immediately understood the key and also why Lillian called him brother. That was the reason. Lillian was not born out of thin air. Her soul already existed when Vivian was born, but at that time Vivian's soul was the dominant one, and she fell into a deep sleep. It was even possible that her soul was still controlled by the will of the Dreadlord. According to the normal process, after the outbreak of the Avatar crisis, Vivian's soul would disappear due to some accident, and Lillian's soul would replace Vivian's body. At the same time, the will of the Dreadlord would descend on her body. At this time, the conditions for the resurrection of the Dreadlord were about to be met. All the accidents happened because of Soren. First, he delayed the time of Lillian's awakening, then killed some children of fear and finally even the vampiric children. These divine powers with the will of the Dreadlord were absorbed and transformed by Soren, and the will of the Dreadlord was naturally killed by him. Note: the details are in the part where Soren walked barefoot for thousands of miles to temper himself by killing the will of the Dreadlord. If these children of fear died in the hands of Vivian, then Lillian would be controlled by the Dreadlord. The will of the Dreadlord gathered little by little, and its influence became greater and greater. Finally, Lillian would become a crazy Witch of Fear. Soren's appearance changed everything. The will of the Dreadlord was eliminated by Soren, and Lillian grew in another way and retained most of her original memories. And these memories were everything that Vivian had experienced. In other words, the will of the Dread Lord was still unable to control her, which directly led to the emergence of another rebellious version of Vivian. As the Witch of Fear, she was naturally different from Vivian, but her experience was equivalent to another hidden sister of Soren. This was also why she called Soren brother. According to the original nature of the Witch of Fear, he was afraid that she would be very crazy and chaotic. In the past, the Witch of Fear loved to bring destruction and fear, and it was very common for her to massacre cities. Otherwise, in the end, the Silver Moon Lady wouldn't have killed her. But the Lillian in front of him was very quiet, and she didn't look like she was dominated by madness and chaos at all. Now, their forms were made up of souls and spirits, and they were the closest to the essence, representing their truest selves. There might be a small problem. However, Soren quickly accepted Lillian's existence because although she was different from Vivian, some things were very similar. Even the way she called him brother was exactly the same. She experienced everything from the perspective of a bystander to Vivian, and, one body two souls, referred to this situation. Come here. Soren didn't have time to think about these things. The most important thing now was to take Vivian and leave this place. The longer they delayed, the higher the chances of the Dread Lord winning. He had to find a way to leave this spiritual space. The Dread Lord is secretly watching us. Soren looked at the countless demons and petitioners around him. These were all illusions of the spiritual world, and they didn't directly reach the throne of fear, so the Dread Lord's power wasn't at its strongest yet. Soren thought of this and said seriously, "Hold on to me tightly later. I will try to use my divine power to break open the space and bring you back to the real world. No matter what happens when you break open the space, don't let go. You must remember this. Otherwise, the Dread Lord will most likely trap you in this spiritual world formed by the throne of fear." The two girls heard this and nodded seriously. Then they hugged Soren's arms from both sides. They had been trapped here for quite some time. As mortals, they knew nothing about the power of gods, and they didn't know how to leave this space. The Dread Lord wanted to use this to wear down their will and make them gradually fall into madness and chaos due to the oppressive and terrifying environment. At that time, there would be a loophole in their will, and the Dread Lord would take advantage of it to control them. Although this was a spiritual world, it perfectly replicated everything in the kingdom of fear. In other words, this place was shrouded in the power of the fear domain. Soren couldn't stay here for too long, and he had to bring the two girls out. "Are you ready?" Soren looked around with a serious expression and said in a deep voice, "When we break open the space later, the Dread Lords will definitely stop us. You have to be careful. P.S. There's only one update for today. This part of the plot requires a lot of thinking before it can be written. A public WeChat account posted a lowly picture that looks like Vivian today. You can go and see if it looks like her." Chapter 867. Changing Reality, Divinity Ability. With the entry of Soren, the whole spiritual space became more and more oppressive. This meant that the will of the Dread Lord had begun to act. Soren's entry made him feel uneasy and was secretly preparing to launch an attack. This was a spiritual space, a collision of will and strength. The Dread Lord, as an old great divine power, naturally had his own trump cards. But at the same time, Sauron, as a new god, also had great perseverance from a mortal to the present. The confrontation between the two sides made it so that neither side was sure to win. At most it was a tie. The golden light of divinity appeared. Soren's whole body seemed to be covered by a golden light. The light of divinity covered Vivian and Lillian, and then a trace of visible black aura was expelled from their bodies. This was the power of the Dread Lord after he trapped them in the spiritual space. It was also a kind of negative emotion that contained fear. The arrival of Soren dispelled this evil power and made the two girls feel more at ease than ever. At the same time, in Vivian's room in the real world, Soren's body was also covered by a golden light. At the same time, the great temple of Motor City suddenly shone brightly, and a hazy shadow appeared above the statue of the central temple. The archbishop in charge of maintaining the temple immediately noticed the abnormality and noticed that Soren was extracting the power of faith from the temple. So, he immediately began to organize all the priests and believers in the temple to pray and feed the power of the temple back to Soren. Soren did not dare to be careless when dealing with the Dread Lord. Although he was dead, his soul still remained in the kingdom of fear. The power of divinity interfered with the whole space. Everything around Soren was distorted, and the figures of countless demons and petitioners became more and more illusory. At the same time, the whole throne of fear shook slightly. Soren directly used his divine power to distort reality to break the spiritual world of the Dread Lord. When a slight crack appeared and was noticed by Soren in his divine form, he immediately raised his hand and pointed to the sky. Change space, divinity power. The key to breaking out of this situation was at this moment. Soren immediately used the power of this space manipulation to open up a crack, and then prepared to leave with Vivian and Lillian. However, at this moment something unexpected happened. In the center of the throne of terror, a tall, slender, and beautiful woman appeared. She had a scar on the side of her face, but it didn't affect her beauty at all. Her expression was empty, as though she was a puppet. She turned to Lillian and said, "Witch of Terror, Lillian? Have you forgotten the purpose of your birth? Your existence is to resurrect Father, Son of Fear." As soon as the beautiful woman spoke, Soren knew her identity. However, most of the signs of fear in the material plane were already dead. The woman in front of him looked like a puppet. She might not even be a living being, but a puppet that the dread demon god had gathered. Finger of Death. Lillian gave the most obvious answer to her question. The little girl raised her hand and threw out a finger of death. Then she curled her lips and said, "I am Lillian. I am me. My fate is not to resurrect the dread demon god. My fate is decided by myself." The beautiful woman dissipated directly under the spell. Lillian's performance made Soren quite fond of her. She was very much to his liking. It had to be said that under normal circumstances Lillian, who was not affected by the will of the dread demon god, acted more decisively like Soren. As soon as the beautiful woman died. But things didn't end like that. A beam of light rose from Soren's palm and broke through the sky, but a second figure appeared on the throne of terror. This time it was an elven ranger. Unlike the previous beautiful woman, Soren knew this elven ranger because they had encountered this elven ranger and were attacked by the hunters. This was the first son of fear that Soren killed. Now one thing was certain. All the sons of fear that appeared on the throne of terror were dead. Their souls were bound in it for some reason. The dread demon god had obviously left something in advance. The elven ranger didn't say much, but directly attacked Soren and the others. He tried to stay and kill the three people in front of him. Greater disintegration. A spell appeared directly, and the elven ranger was killed on the spot. However, with the death of the elven ranger, this time two sons of fear appeared on the throne of terror. One was dressed as a wizard, and the other looked like a barbarian. These two sons of fear were obviously more powerful. The will of the dread demon god was preventing them from leaving. When the third batch of sons of fear was killed, the fourth batch of sons of fear appeared again. It was as if they couldn't be killed. In a short time, more than 10 sons of fear had appeared in a row, and they were getting stronger and stronger. "Leave it to me." Soren frowned and glanced at the sons of fear in front of him. It was now the fifth batch. Just as he broke through the space, the sons of fear appeared faster and faster. Death's hand. Most of the sons of fear were close to the legendary level. In front of Soren they had no power to fight back. However, the later their power seemed to be more and more concentrated, and the sons of fear that appeared became stronger and stronger. Soren even had a feeling that he might meet an old opponent. His premonition came true. When Soren killed the seventh batch of sons of fear, the whole throne of terror suddenly trembled, and then all the power began to gather toward the center. Then countless blood-red bats appeared, and directly gathered in the center of the throne of terror to form a handsome but very dangerous man in a noble suit. Vampire demigod Reinhardt. The Dread Lord had indeed left a mark on the soul of the sons of fear. Although the vampire demigod Reinhardt in front of him still looked like a shell, his expression was obviously not the same as all the previous sons of fear. He smiled strangely at Soren and said slowly, "Leave them. Otherwise you will stay here forever." This arrogant tone made Soren frown. Then he raised his hand and sent out a divine shockwave. He said coldly, "If I can kill you once, I can kill you a second time." The divine shockwave directly hit Reinhardt and sent him flying. However, he was not seriously injured. As the most powerful son of fear, his recovery speed was amazing. Soren was always paying attention to the surroundings. Since even Reinhardt had appeared, it was only a matter of time before the Dread Lords will appeared. This would be the first head-on confrontation between them. P.S. That's all for today. Let's prepare and try to finish this paragraph tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Chapter 868. Ah! Strange laughter sounded. After the demigod vampire took a round of attacks from Soren, he was still intact. His body continued to repair at an amazing speed, and it seemed that the power of the Sons of Fear had gathered on him. From a certain perspective, the current him was even more powerful than when he was alive. No. The real demigod vampire was dead. His soul was finally imprisoned by the Hellpemer, so the demigod vampire in front of him should be the incarnation of the Dread Lord. Divine Shockwave. Shadow Step, Shadow Divinity. Order, Death. Soren didn't want to fight with his opponent for a long time. This was the spiritual world created by the Dread Lord, which was equivalent to the enemy's home space. The longer the battle dragged on, the more disadvantageous it would be for him. The demigod vampire recovered too quickly, so Soren simply used a round of big moves. At that time, the demigod vampire was in a state of near death, and finally he used Order, Death, to end his opponent. The demigod vampire died on the spot. Although Reinhardt was very strong, Soren was no longer who he used to be. Now, his strength had improved a lot compared to the past. As a god with mid-level divine power, even the demigod vampire would find it difficult to survive one round of his attacks. But, at the moment when the demigod vampire died, a little accident happened. His body suddenly turned into a sky full of bats, and then he was resurrected in the throne of fear. It's useless. This is our world. You can't kill me here. The handsome face of the demigod vampire gradually distorted, and a crazy smile appeared on his face. Then he rushed toward Soren again. He had fully recovered. There was no trace of injury at all. If there was any change, it was that his strength seemed to be a little stronger than before. This was something that Soren couldn't understand. He didn't know what power the Dread Lord kept in this space. At present, the only thing that Soren could be sure of was that this space had some connection with the Throne of Fear in the real world, because even if he wanted to open a crack, it would not be so easy. Plain teleportation, divine spark. However, what was the basis of this spiritual space? Soren was prepared to use brute force to create a crack. He activated his divine power and instantly entered his divine spirit form. Then he reached out and grabbed Vivian and Lillian. With a wave of his hand, he used his divine power to tear open a spatial rift and teleported them out. The entire space shook violently. The throne of fear that was built in the center of this world was slowly collapsing. Soren let out a sigh of relief after sending the two girls out. However, at this time, the demigod vampire's expression suddenly became ferocious. He roared madly, "Since you insist on sending them away, then you can stay here yourself." The demigod vampire's body began to twist. His originally handsome appearance began to become ferocious, and his body expanded at an astonishing speed. Bone spurs appeared on his back, and a pair of ferocious horns grew out of his forehead. A tail with poisonous thorns also appeared on his tailbone. At this moment, the appearance of the demigod vampire had changed greatly. He looked like a demon from the bottomless abyss. No, it should be said that he looked like a slaughterer. The power of the Dread Lord came from the three gods of death, which meant that he came from the same source as Soren. The ancient god of death, Jurgel. After Jurgel was tired of the constraints of the divine title, he gave his power to the three gods of death at that time. Among them, the god of slaughter, Baal, gave birth to the son of slaughter. The god of tyranny, Bane, was resurrected after death and expanded his divine title into fear. Eventually he fell in the hands of the Dread Lord. To put it simply, the power of the Dread Lord was inherited from the three gods of death. His core priesthoods were fear and destruction. He himself was also an evolution of death and slaughter. The form that the demigod vampire had now transformed into was a slaughterer full of destructive aura. In other words, he was now the incarnation of the Dread Lord. It finally appeared. The invisible power of the law bound the space. After Vivian and Lillian were sent away, Soren was temporarily trapped in this world. However, his expression did not show any panic. His power and that of the Dread Lord came from the same source. Although Soren was only an intermediate divine power, which was far inferior to the greater divine power of the Dread Lord, the Dread Lord's body was already dead. It was just an incarnation controlled by his soul, which was not enough to threaten Soren's life. Slaughter domain. Death domain. For the first time, the power that was close to the origin collided violently. The blood of the son of slaughter that Soren inherited and the fusion of the death domain spread throughout the entire space, while the demigod vampire's slaughterer incarnation shrouded the entire throne with the power of destruction and fear. Shadow, Divine Title. The space was still in the hands of the Dread Lord, which was a little unfavorable for Soren. So he activated his divine title of Shadow in an instant, and then he saw that everything in the whole world was covered with a gray haze. The sky became gray. The earth became gray. Everything was like a shadow that made people feel depressed and uneasy. In this spiritual world, Soren's shadow even directly reflected on everything, making the whole space look like a shadow plane. A silver-white stream of light emerged. Soren's figure disappeared in an instant. The next moment he appeared behind the slaughterer. With a storm-like attack, countless wounds immediately appeared on the body of the slaughterer. Blasphemy. Death. The light of divinity emerged. Soren's figure did not leave any trace. It appeared completely out of thin air wherever he wanted to appear. This was the power of the Shadow, divine title. Soren was the master of the shadow. He could travel through shadows at will within the range of the shadow. The end. The incarnation of the vampiric demigod vampire was once again killed by Soren. However, at the moment of the slaughterer's death, suddenly a ferocious and terrifying shadow of the demon god appeared. It madly rushed toward Soren and actually tried to occupy his will. The throne of fear gradually collapsed. The whole spiritual world was on the verge of destruction, and the body of the Dread Lord finally appeared. In the space where Vivian and Lillian had been teleported out, the crazy Dread Lord actually tried to occupy Soren, who had also absorbed the power of the divine title of fear. You're overestimating yourself. Soren looked at the shadow of the demon god that rushed toward him. His whole body turned into a golden humanoid, directly transforming into a divine form and colliding with the Dread Lord. The collision of souls broke out in an instant. At this moment, the throne of fear was completely shattered, and the whole spiritual world collapsed rapidly. After a violent collision, Soren's golden figure turned into a beam of light that went straight into the sky. Then he completely disappeared from this world. Where is this? It only took a moment to travel through space. When Soren defeated the will of the Dread Lord and returned again, he was surprised to find that he did not return to the city of Moder. He did not even return to his body at all. He appeared in a dusky world. A real world. In front of Soren's eyes was a wide river, and he did not know where it flowed to. He could see countless souls floating in the river, and there were vague figures wearing black tattered cloaks and holding huge scythes patrolling around the river. Soren looked at everything in front of him, and his expression seemed a little confused. He murmured, "The river Styx? How did I suddenly appear in the underworld?" This was the territory of the Grim Reaper. The closest to the material plane was the Shadow Plane, and the next closest to the Shadow Plane was the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm was already a forbidden area for the living. Most of the creatures there were in the form of spirits and undead. Below the spiritual realm was the river Styx. The river Styx began to branch from here. The main river of the river Styx went directly to the sea of the underworld, and other branches went to the lower planes such as the Bator Inferno, the Bottomless Abyss, the Grey Wilderness and the Scorched Hell. Very few people entered the underworld. Only the most daring demon soul stealer dared to sneak into the underworld and steal souls from the servants of the Grim Reaper. Soren was now in the underworld. And he appeared in the underworld in the form of a soul. According to the width of the river Styx and the patrolling servants of the Grim Reaper, his position was very likely to be close to the sea of the underworld. Chapter 869. Why did he suddenly come to the underworld? At this moment, Soren was also a little confused because he still remembered what happened at the last moment. At that time he had already suppressed the power of the Dread Lord. After all, a dead god couldn't cause too much trouble. At the last moment, the Dread Lord was doomed to fail, so he directly attacked Soren, trying to use Soren's connection with absorbing the divinity of fear to occupy his mind. How could he possibly succeed in this? Soren's will was as strong as steel. He directly transformed into his divine form and smashed the spirit of the Dread Lord. As an ancient great divine power, the essence of the Dread Lord's soul was preserved on the throne of fear inside the divine kingdom of fear after his death. In other words, as long as the throne of fear was not destroyed, his spirit and soul could be constantly repaired. Even if the divine will was suppressed and killed by Soren, it would only make him weak, but it couldn't really kill the Dread Lord. To put it simply, the Dread Lord was now like a lich, and now the throne of fear was his phylactery. Something's wrong. After Soren defeated the spiritual entity of the Dread Lord's first attack, He set the teleportation beacon at Mordor City before the space shattered and was ready to directly return to his physical body. Under normal circumstances, it was almost impossible for a god to have an accident when using the divinity of plane teleportation to teleport. Therefore, Soren's appearance in the underworld was most likely due to a man-made reason. And the person who could interfere with his teleportation and set it in the underworld must have a much higher divinity than Soren. There were not many such existences in the whole multiverse. As for the one who had something to do with the underworld, it seemed that there was only one. The ancient god of death, Jianghu. As soon as Soren thought of this, he heard a calm and indifferent voice saying slowly, "The new shadow god, the one outside of fate, welcome to the underworld. I was just wondering when you would think of me." The god of death, Jianghu. Even though Soren had yet to see him, his voice was enough to prove his identity. Jianghu's last words also proved his identity. This was because some abnormally powerful gods had the ability to sense. For their divine names, not to mention speaking them out loud, just hearing them in one's mind would produce a divine sense. As soon as Soren thought of Jianghu, the god of death, he was able to sense the presence of a divine being. This kind of divine power was beyond Soren's understanding of divine beings. The fog in front of him gradually dispersed. A pair of death servants in tattered gray cloaks appeared in front of Soren. In front of them was a boat of the river Styx, with necromancers holding books and pens on both sides. They were all natives of the underworld. The Grim Reaper rarely received souls personally. To the deities who held the divine title of death, their duty was to maintain the order of death in the multiverse and the movement of souls. On the other hand, the death that mortals would sometimes unwittingly see was actually an attendant chosen from their believers. Just like the otherworldly oracles that Soren prepared to help him manage the kingdom of God, the death servants were a different kind of oracles. These existences similar to petitioners would not be trapped in the underworld. They were endowed with a little divinity of death and could travel between many planes. "Lord of Shadows, please come with me." A hoarse voice was heard. The necromancer with a withered face made an inviting gesture to Soren and slowly said, "My lord Jianghu wants to see you." No one knew how long this necromancer had existed. His soul was full of the smell of decay. The ancient Grim Reaper, Jianghu, liked to record death. Many of his followers started recording all kinds of deaths in the Thorium era. The necromancer in front of him was probably above level 35. Although his name was not spread in the multiverse, Soren could sense that this necromancer was not much weaker than some famous liches left behind from the Nesser era. This was the foundation of time. As the oldest Grim Reaper in the multiverse, Jianghu probably had many servants like this under his command. Yes. Soren was not afraid at all. Instead, he was a little curious and directly followed the necromancer to the boat of the Styx. Jianghu was not a god that needed to be afraid. This was because to a certain extent, he was a god that disliked the affairs of the other gods. Even when the god of murder went crazy, Jianghu only had a slight trace of mockery. He did not have the slightest intention of interfering. Even before the rise of the three death gods, Jianghu was already tired of his priesthood. He gave away almost all of his core priesthoods, only keeping a part related to the death records. In the following years, most of Jianghu's tasks were to help the king of the dead familiarize himself with his priesthood. After giving up his priesthood, Jianghu had been living like this. In a way that was close to being a hermit, he first assisted the king of bones, Mirko, then the king of the dead, Klemvox. Other than helping them maintain the law of death, Jianghu did not interfere with the affairs of the other gods. Currently, Jianghu was a minor divine power. There was almost no religion in the mortal world. Only the oldest writings recorded a little bit of it. In the Eastern Kingdom, there was a small inscription that recorded such a short passage. The ancient Grim Reaper, Jianghu, was tired of fulfilling his duties. When he was almost forgotten by the world, he gave most of his priesthoods to the god of tyranny, Bane, the god of murder, Baal, and the king of bones, Mirko. After the death of these gods, he continued to serve the god of murder, Sirik, and the king of the dead, Klemvox. He was only loyal to the position of king of the dead, so if the incumbent could not fulfill his duties properly, he would secretly overthrow him. Jianghu barely maintained his cooperation with the former Grim Reaper, Klemvox, and was quite harmonious with the current Grim Reaper, and still had a contemptuous attitude towards Sirik. In the Eastern Kingdom, there was an abandoned ruin, and there was such a short passage recorded in it. Why did the Grim Reaper Jianghu want to see him? The first thing that came to Soren's mind was someone outside of fate. Gloria also said that he was outside of the River of Fate. According to the divination of the northern witches, people outside of fate were full of infinite variables. The most representative of them were Sirik and Klemvox, who had inherited the priesthood of death respectively. Although Jurgel was powerful, Soren was not afraid. The source of his power came from Jurgel, the Grim Reaper, and this existence almost no longer interfered with the affairs of mortals and gods. P.S. First update. Today is the 3rd. Chapter 870. Soren soon met Jurgel. This legendary ancient god of death looked very ordinary, just like an ordinary necromancer scholar. At this moment, he was holding a quill pen and writing something on a parchment on the boat of the river Styx. The Church of Jurgel had always been recording death, and it could even be said that it was waiting for the moment when everything ended. Because in the Church of Jurgel, it was believed that even the planes and the universe had a moment of death. There were even people who once thought that the real mission of Jurgel was to witness and record the death of the entire multiverse. The Avatar crisis did not seem to have much impact on Jurgel, because his priesthood had basically been given away. The king of the dead, Klemvox, should have fallen to the material plane, but Jurgel seemed to have no impact on the underworld. But it seemed that he should not be able to enter his own kingdom at the moment. But there was nothing in his kingdom. At his level he probably did not even need a kingdom. Great divinity. The existence closest to the great divine power in the entire multiverse. Although he gave up the priesthood of death, he was still the most powerful ancient god. If the gods were the product of the law, then at Jurgel's level he was close to the great law. In the long history of the multiverse, he was the only god who gave his power to others because he was tired of his priesthood. And after so many years of divine wars and catastrophes, he was still alive and well with only a minor divine power. No god dared to provoke him. He became a bystander and only occasionally helped the new god of death to manage things. There was one thing that must be mentioned. Soren had always thought that the expansion of the river Styx was inseparable from the god of death, Jurgel. Because in the most ancient times the river Styx was just a small branch, but now the river Styx had run through the entire multiverse. There were even branches of the river Styx on Mountain Paradise. It was worth mentioning that the god of death, Jurgel, had a good relationship with the ancient sun god, Amonada. After the ancient sun god fell, the reincarnation of Luoshanda was now the god of light. The expansion of the river Styx was not recorded in history. But since the birth of many planes, the river Styx had flowed from the highest level of Mountain Paradise to the deepest part of the abyss. Soren would never believe that Jurgel, the god of death, wasn't behind all of this. Furthermore, there had been the Wall of the Faithless in the past, but the Nether River was now maintaining the cycle of life and death across the multiverse. Very few souls were sealed inside the Wall of the Faithless, with most souls being transported to the Origin Sea through the Nether River and eventually reborn from death. That was how the development of death came about, and Jurgel's shadow was behind everything. Young deity. Jurgel's face was withered and he looked like a mummy. As the oldest god, he didn't seem to care about his appearance. The ancient god of death slowly put down the quill and looked up at Soren. You seem to have a lot of questions. Yes. Soren nodded. After thinking for a while, he asked directly, "Did you summon me here?" Jurgel glanced at him and said calmly, "I guess so." Soren frowned. "Why did you summon me to the underworld, Lord Jurgel?" He went straight to the point. For a bystander like Jurgel, Soren didn't need to beat around the bush. Even in this avatar's crisis, Jurgel was still a little detached from the world, because even this avatar's crisis couldn't completely affect him. If gods were regarded as gods, then the avatar's crisis was a tribulation of heaven and earth, and Jurgel had already transcended the tribulation. There must be a reason for such a being to meet Soren in person. Such a being must have his own mission. Just like Father Oak could sacrifice himself without hesitation, Jurgel must have his own ultimate goal, and it was very likely that this goal was beyond all the gods. Just a small matter. Jurgel's tone didn't change. He said slowly, "Everything has an end. And those who welcome the end but don't want to return to death always make me feel a little troubled. I have a little trouble that I need you to help me solve." Trouble? Soren listened to Jurgel thoughtfully. Welcome the end but don't want to return to death. Are you talking about the Dreadlord? The Dreadlord was dead. But he wasn't completely dead yet. His power came from Jurgel, and his state of being near death could indeed make Jurgel feel troubled. Jurgel nodded slowly. Then he looked at Soren and said, "People outside of fate are full of infinite variables. Transcending death means transcending fate. The last Avatar's crisis gave birth to a group of new gods. And this time's Avatar's crisis means that the laws of the multiverse have changed again. Some gods should disappear with the laws, but because of you, there are some changes outside of fate. What I need to do now is to correct the part that belongs to death. The Dread Lord should have fallen. He turned death into pure destruction and fear, which has deviated from the true meaning of death. I hope you can destroy him. If possible, it's best to take over a part of the clergy of death. Although Clemvox is a qualified god of death, he's still too kind. Eternal sleep is just to maintain the rules of death, but it can't make death go any further. The Lord of Eternal Sleep, Clemvox. After Clemvox took over the clergy of death, he was obsessed with letting the undead enter eternal sleep. He was not as cruel as the other gods of death. After the last Avatar's crisis, Clemvox took over the clergy of death. He spent most of his time with Jurgil in the Crystal Tower of the Underworld, learning about the responsibilities and requirements of the position of King of the Dead from the latter. Although the Forgotten One, another name of Jurgil's cold practical views and merciless cold-bloodedness troubled Clemvox, he still respected Jurgil very much. It was not an exaggeration to say that he believed in this ancient god. Although the two got along quite well, Clemvox was a kind warrior when he was alive. There were many contradictions between his ideas and Jurgil's. Strictly speaking, Jurgil the god of death should be ruthless and neutral. He believed that death treated all things the same, and there was no difference between good and evil. Clemvox, on the other hand, was more inclined to kindness. The church had been doing more to appease the undead for so many years, and he even developed the field of eternal sleep. Is that all? Soren frowned and looked at Jurgil, then slowly said, "The Dread Lord is an enemy that I have to destroy. Even without your order, I will find a way to kill him completely. The Dread Lord must die. If he doesn't die, Vivian won't be safe." Jurgil was not surprised by Soren's words, because he had long noticed this new god. When Soren became a god, he had already entered Jurgil's sight. He said lightly, "If that's the case, there's another thing that may trouble you. But this is also a fate that you can't escape." Chapter 871. Fate? Soren could not help but frown when he heard that. Death god Jurgil did not have any reaction to this. Instead, he said calmly, "As a new god, your performance has surprised many people. However, there was someone who was even more amazing than you. In just a few years, he went from a mortal to a god, and a powerful one at that. He obtained most of the death priesthoods. Do you know who he is?" Soren could not help but tremble when he heard Jurgil's words. He then said in a low voice, "Yes. Ysiric." Jurgil's eyes moved a little when he mentioned this name. He then continued, "That's right. Ysiric. The fastest rising mortal in the history of the multiverse. He even became one of the most powerful gods. Clemvox is the king of the dead. But the one who obtained most of my death priesthoods was Cyric. He first took Mirko's death priesthoods and then Baal's massacre priesthoods. He even took in most of Banon's believers when he died. However, Cyric's ambition was too great. He was eventually destroyed by his own crazy ambition. As a god, you should know a little about this history. Later, under my guidance, Clemvox took Mirko's death priesthoods from Cyric and became the king of the dead. Cyric's madness did not stop because of this. After losing Mirko's death priesthoods, he turned his ambition to the god of tyranny, Banon, who had just been resurrected. This battle between the gods was not recorded in history. However, in the end he succeeded. The god of tyranny, Banon, fell. The priesthoods that originally belonged to Banon became empty because of this. However, the gods at that time were already afraid of what Cyric had done. They were afraid that Cyric would cause another catastrophe after obtaining the power of the god of tyranny. Hence, the priesthood of the god of tyranny eventually fell into the hands of a lucky person in this conspiracy. He is the current Dread Lord, but because of Cyric, the Dread Lord moved his kingdom to the abyss. Cyric's crazy ambition has made the gods dissatisfied and afraid. After the death of the god of tyranny, the gods finally decided to join forces to punish and judge Cyric. In the end, he was exiled and sealed. Even now, he is still imprisoned in the space where the gods sealed him. The words of death Jurgil ended here. However, Soren had already understood the general situation of the matter. This matter was indeed related to the god of murder, because according to the original history, Sirik should have escaped during the middle and later stages of the Avatar crisis. For Sirik, this troublemaker, most of the gods had a headache because his ambition was too great. He was not satisfied with being one of the strongest gods at that time. He even tried to become the only true god at that time. If he had not done this, Sirik's ending would not have been so tragic. At that time, the gods could not defeat Sirik at all without joining forces. At his peak, Sirik was very close to the great divine power. At the same time, he mastered the priesthoods of death, slaughter, and conspiracy, and incorporated most of the original followers of the three gods of death. It could be said that he became the evil god with the most followers and the most priesthoods at that time. What Death Jurgil was really worried about was not the Dread Lord, but the god of murder, Sirik, who had not yet been released. The priesthood of Baal was on him. At present, the situation of the death god system was that Clemvox was in charge of the priesthood of the King of the Dead. He was currently a great divine power, and the Dread Lord was also a great divine power, but now he had fallen. The core of the slaughter priesthood was on Sirik, and he was also in charge of the conspiracy priesthood. At the end of the first Avatar crisis, Sirik regarded Clemvox as his greatest enemy, and at the same time he hated the third-generation goddess of magic very much. However, later the god of tyranny was resurrected, and he regarded tyranny as his greatest threat. At that time, after the conspiracy to kill the god of tyranny, Sirik also took part of tyranny's priesthood. Together with the original slaughter priesthood, he was almost the most dangerous among the great divine powers. Therefore, even if Sirik had been sealed for a long time, when he ran out during the Avatar crisis, his power was maintained above the intermediate divine power. He was not like Soren's half-baked intermediate divine power now. He was the kind of intermediate divine power that was above the old gods, and very close to the great divine power. According to the progress of the past history, Sirik was scheming for the power of the Dread Lord as soon as he came out, and if he could seize the priesthood of the Dread Lord, then even the current King of the Dead, Clemvox, would not be his opponent at all. He was the existence that gave Death Jurgil a headache. Sure enough, they wanted him to deal with Sirik. Soren quickly guessed the whole story, but his heart was a little heavy. Jurgil was right. Sirik was one of the enemies that Soren had to face. Because Soren himself had the blood of the son of Slaughter, he now had the Slaughter domain and received the information of the Slaughter priesthood. It was because Sirik was sealed that Soren could steal and obtain the Slaughter priesthood. Otherwise, if Sirik was fine, he would not be able to get the information of the Slaughter priesthood so easily. Moreover, Sirik was a very narrow-minded, self-centered, and extremely extreme god. With such a character, if he ran out after being sealed for a long time and suddenly found that part of his Slaughter priesthood had been taken away by Soren, then what would he do? Soren would almost certainly start a war with him, and in this hostile relationship, there would be a fight for the power of the Dread Lord. Everything started to become clear. Soren immediately grasped the key to breaking the situation, and that was the dead Dread Lord. Now, Soren and Sirik were both mid-level gods, and even if there was a gap, it would not be too big. Sirik was a loner, and he had made too many enemies. His enemies were everywhere in the pantheon of gods. Soren's relationship with other gods was not bad, and he even had some gods as allies. If they really fought, the chances of winning should be about 50%. So the power of the Dread Lord was the key. If Soren could obtain the power of the Dread Lord, or if he could help Vivian obtain the power of the Dread Lord, then there would be no problem in dealing with Sirik. But if Sirik obtained the power of the Dread Lord, then Soren would have almost no chance of winning. That was probably the reason why Jurgil wanted to see him today. Perhaps to this primordial god of death who no longer cared about the affairs of the gods, Sirik was a troublemaker who caused a huge headache. P.S. Third update. Please pay attention. Chapter 872. Sirik was an anomaly among the natives. Looking at the history of the entire multiverse, no one rose faster than him. Even the adventurers who were lucky enough to become gods during the Avatar crisis were far behind him. If one only looked at the first half of Sirik's story, then he had the aura of a protagonist. He went all the way from a mortal to one of the most powerful gods at that time. However, if one added Sirik's record of courting death in the second half of the story, then the whole story had the illusion of a protagonist turning into a villain. It could be said that Sirik finally forced the gods to join forces to seal him because he was too ambitious and loved courting death. After all, he was the one who had gathered all the clergies of the three gods of death. Even the main gods of the pantheon did not dare to look down on him. Sirik, on the other hand, had been acting alone for a very long time. He only had temporary allies and no subordinate gods. Soren fell into silence. He was not very confident in dealing with Sirik. Every time he mentioned Sirik, he felt that this guy seemed to have the aura of a protagonist. If he wanted to deal with him, Soren felt that he needed to hug the legs of the goddess of luck. Although Sirik was unlucky, that was also the effect of the protagonist's aura. If it was another god who courted death like that, it would not be as simple as being sealed. They would probably be dead. Schemes that would have been punishable by death in the hands of other gods were merely sealed away in the hands of Sirik. And he actually came out during the time of troubles. Dealing with Sirik was much more difficult than dealing with the Shadow Lord. Although Sirik's strength had been greatly reduced, his clergies were still murder, lie, deceit, and illusion. His domains were chaos, destruction, slaughter, evil, illusion, and crafty. That's right. Sirik also had the crafty domain, and his abilities were almost all combat type. While Soren was deep in thought, Grim Reaper Jurgel spoke again. Dealing with Sirik won't be easy. But I can give you some help. In any case, this little bit of power won't be of much use to me. Since that's the case, let it be the foundation of your death priesthood. After that, the ancient god of death, Jurgel, pointed at Soren and a golden light appeared. Then a strong aura of death rushed into Soren's body. Rows of data appeared. Receive the gift of the Grim Reaper, Jurgel. You've obtained the divine power of death. You have obtained partial information about the divine domain of death. The second message from the death clergy appeared. The god of death, Jurgel, gave a portion of his divine power to Soren, helping him get one step closer to the divine domain of death. My priesthood doesn't suit you. After Jurgel was done, he slowly said, so you will have to rely on yourself to wield the power of the divine domain of death. For now. The god of death, Jurgel, only kept 3 priesthoods related to death. They were Fatalism, Death Recorder, and Tomb Guard. These 3 were insignificant priesthoods. And these priesthoods didn't suit Soren at all. The only reason Jurgel kept these priesthoods was to make it easier for him to record deaths. As a great existence of divinity, he almost gave up most of his divinity and divine power. All right. After Jurgel was done, he waved his hand and said, you should go back now. Don't stay in the underworld for too long. The gods were very weak during the time of troubles, and the saints couldn't resist the corrosion of the underworld. The underworld was a very special place. Under normal circumstances, even if it wasn't during the Avatar crisis, the gods didn't like to enter the underworld. Soren came back to his senses. He bowed slightly to Jurgel in front of him to express his gratitude, then turned and walked out. In any case, Jurgel helped him get one step closer to obtaining the divine domain of death. The ancient god of death had been looking for a suitable agent. The 3 gods of death of the previous generation were the first agents he chose, and now the king of the dead, Klemvox, was the second agent he chose. This existence's domain of death was beyond any other god. Even Soren didn't know what he wanted. After leaving the boat of the Styx, Soren directly teleported back to the city of Moder. There was nothing to stay in the underworld, and Klemvox, the king of the dead, might not be very friendly to Soren. After all, his relationship with the goddess of magic was complicated, and there was a certain competitive relationship with her. As soon as he returned to the city of Moder, Soren saw Vivian standing nervously beside him, and in front of him was Soren's body, which seemed to be meditating with his eyes closed. Soul separation was very simple for Soren. In the blink of an eye, Soren returned to his body, and at this moment, the little girl saw him wake up and rushed to him, holding his hand tightly and saying, "Brother, you're finally awake. I was so worried." Soren smiled and touched the little girl's head. Suddenly, he seemed to think of something and said, "Are you Vivian or Lillian?" The little girl's expression froze when she heard the words, then she whispered, "I'm Vivian. Lillian rarely comes out. She usually controls the body in the afternoon or evening." "Brother. I'm sorry." As if she felt that she had done something wrong, Vivian apologized without saying a word. Soren originally wanted to scold her, but after seeing the god of death, Jurgel, Sirik's existence was like a mountain on his body, making him feel a little nervous. The Dread Lord had not been dealt with yet, and now Sirik had come out. Soren felt that time was not on his side. Compared to these things, Lillian's existence was not that important. As long as he could get rid of the Dread Lord and Sirik, it would be easier to reconstruct the body and soul separation. Sirik must also be killed. Because even if he killed the Dread Lord, if he did not kill Sirik, he would definitely turn his attention to Vivian, who had just inherited the Dread Lord's power. A new god who had just inherited the power. Oh my god. What an easy lamb to deal with. If Sirik did not die, he would be plotting all day long to kill Vivian and take her godhood. Lillian was still within Soren's acceptable range. However, Sirik belonged to the category of gods who must die. Soren felt that he had to think carefully, especially to organize his thoughts and recall the gods who were the most hostile to Sirik. To deal with someone like Sirik who had great luck, he could only think of ways to borrow his strength. P.S. First update. There is another chapter for today. Chapter 873. Gloria returned to the city of Motor the next day. She brought back a lot of alchemy devices and went into crazy research as soon as she came back. Soren didn't tell her about Sirik. As a mortal, she couldn't help much now. Telling her would make Gloria worry more. Vivian woke up in the form of a demigod. At present, the only thing the little girl lacked was a clergy. As long as she had a clergy, she could be promoted to minor divine power. A lot of things happened during this time. First of all, the goddess of fortune appeared in the city of wealth. The reason seemed to be related to the legendary lucky coin. Soren didn't know if he should get close to the goddess because he had the blessing of the goddess of misfortune. Then the elves and the orcs broke out again. This time the scale was much smaller. It seemed that the two divine systems had restrained a lot. The internal strife of the drows had stopped. The Queen of Spiders should have regained control of everything. There were gradually signs of unification inside the Underdark. The Principality of Rossard was more serious. As Soren guessed, the Duke of Red Dragon's wife was backed by a demon duke. And it was the legendary Queen of Yuma. Lord of Hell, the daughter of Asmodeus. This was like poking a hornet's nest. Even the Church of the God of Light was now having a headache. It was not difficult to deal with the Queen of Yuma, but if Asmodeus was drawn out, then only the God of Light himself could deal with him. Right. There was another standard of great divinity. In addition to death, the other was the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus. He had experienced the ancient war and killed many ancient demons. The Queen of Yuma should be the first demon duke to appear in the eyes of the world. As the daughter of Asmodeus, she had always tried to prove her ability. She didn't rely on her father's power, but relied on her own strength to achieve the status of demon duke. So this time, the trouble caused by the Church of Light would not be so easy to solve. At least the confrontation between the demons and the church would last for a while. Soren had been paying attention to the outside world. However, because he knew about Sirik, he didn't want to intervene in many things. The latest news was related to the Halflings. As a race with a small population, the Halflings also had their own gods. This time, the Halflings' guardian goddess, Yoda, seemed to have appeared. The goddess who had created the Halfling race had appeared in the Shire region and had fought with a god. As for who it was still uncertain. In addition, one thing that had happened in the beginning had been made clear. It was the Death Valley mentioned earlier, where a strong aura of life suddenly appeared. This was obviously a miracle created when a god who was in charge of life fell to the mortal world. This goddess was Angrus, the elven goddess of life. She was also the current wife of the elven god system's chief god, Corlan Larison, the person who replaced the Queen of Spiders, Lolth, as the matriarch of the elven pantheon. She was in charge of spring, birth, fertility, and planting, an extension of the life priesthood. It was because she fell to the mortal world that there were strong signs of life in the Death Valley. At present, she had returned to the elven god system. As for why she didn't see her husband until now, the outside world didn't know the reason at all. A few days passed in the blink of an eye. The third wave of the Avatar crisis was still brewing, and the figures of the demons began to appear frequently. It seemed that in the first few waves they had become more active than the demons. In the eyes of the demons, the material plane was a rich treasure. A large number of high-quality souls were waiting for them to harvest, which could greatly improve their power and status. Recently, some special people began to appear in Motor City. Most of these people were women, and they were all young and beautiful women who could sing and dance. Most of these beautiful women were bards, dancers, performers, and so on. They had a special emblem on their chests, which was a triangle formed by 3 different colors, yellow, orange, red, of hexagons. This was the emblem of the goddess of joy. No one knew when it started, but the believers of the goddess of joy came uninvited. Now, many performers serving the goddess of joy could be seen in Port Motor. They either sang and danced in the taverns or performed directly on the streets. From time to time, passers-by couldn't help but stop and watch. Occasionally there would be a burst of cheers. These beautiful women all had good skills, and their beautiful dance made Port Mordor happy. Soren had been secretly paying attention to these things, but he had no intention of directly interfering. The goddess of joy had her own mission. At present, because of the Avatar crisis, there was no joy in many places. When war came, gods like the goddess of joy would become very awkward, which was why her followers came to the city of Mordor. At present, in the material plane, only a few places such as Motor City, Arendelle, and the Northern Council could still make them happy. As for other places, those who were still hungry had no energy to watch their dances and songs. The goddess of joy, she was the goddess of joy, happiness, dance, festivals, and freedom. Her domains included chaos, charm, family, kindness, and so on. She was a kind goddess who liked to do whatever she wanted. She was also one of the goddesses who was inclined to hedonism. She basically did not have much ambition. Many of her believers were extremely devout, and she was popular all over the world. She was regarded as the propagator of joy. Her temple often raised donations by holding grand celebrations, and then put the money raised into various seemingly unplanned uses, such as concentrating on beautifying a public area, or spending a lot of money to hold a feast for a serious local lord. A feast. In short, this goddess and her believers were a little funny. The goddess of wealth and the goddess of joy used to be very close allies, but after the previous goddess of wealth's accident in the time of troubles, some of her believers began to turn to the goddess of joy, so the relationship between the two goddesses later became much colder. The enemy of the goddess of joy was the goddess of pain and torture, Lauvita. The goddess of pain, injury, agony, torment, suffering, and torture, the aforementioned maiden of pain. The hatred between the two goddesses had been long-standing. As early as the last time of troubles, the high priestess of the goddess of joy, Clanaangelos, who was once the lover of the goddess of joy, was murdered by the forces of the local Lauvita sect. Under the instructions of the goddess of joy, her believers formed an assassination cult called the Scarlet Dancers, and began to tour the world. At the same time, under the cover of delicate and deadly dances, they used dancing shoes with hidden blades to take the lives of the Maiden of Pain's believers. From then on, the battle between the two churches never stopped. The sea could accommodate all rivers. Soren was tolerant enough of the arrival of the believers of the goddess of joy. He sent people to give these performers a piece of land and let them build a small temple to worship the goddess of joy. Of course, this was not without a price. Soren was having a headache over Vivian's priesthood, so he was very interested in the position of the Maiden of Pain, Lauvita. Originally, he wanted to let the High Priestess contact them. But considering that the goddess of joy was a famous lesbian goddess, he thought that he should have the opportunity to contact her again. P.S. Second update. Please pay attention. Chapter 874. The monthly votes will be voided soon. Everyone who has a monthly vote, please vote. After 12 o'clock it was cleared out. Soren began to plan for Vivian's priesthood. What do you think Vivian should choose as her starting priesthood? The priesthood of fear is still too early. She must first have a transitional priesthood. Chapter 875. Port Mordor Deepwater Alley. It only took a day for the believers of the Lady of Joy to build a small altar. Most of these believers were quite handsome, and many of the performers had to have a certain level of appearance. At this moment, these believers were performing the last important ritual. A pair of beautiful human girls picked up 2 weapons and threw them on the ground. Then, under the guidance of the priests, the surrounding believers covered the weapons with a pair of fresh flowers, completely burying the 2 weapons in it. This ceremony was called abandon violence, and it was also a ceremony that represented the principles of the Lady of Joy. This goddess did not like to fight. Then, the believers began to prepare for the celebration. As mentioned before, the Lady of Joy was a bit of a funny goddess, and those who believed and served her were also a bit funny. In the Church of the Goddess of Joy, almost every holiday that had nothing to do with evil beliefs was a reason for the church to hold celebrations. In other words, they could always find reasons to hold all kinds of celebrations full of joy. As for how many people would participate, it was not something they could decide. The arrival of the goddess of joy added a touch of vitality to the city of Mordor. However, Soren had always had strict restrictions on the gods. He did not exclude people who liked and believed in the goddess of joy, but he would never allow this kind of hedonism to prevail in the city of Mordor. Therefore, the whole process of the ceremony was filled with members of the church and a small number of hedonistic civilians in the port of Mordor. Flowers, wine, music, and dancing. A simple celebration soon began. Beautiful singers danced around the altar, and bards played a variety of instruments next to them. The priest was praying in it, and with the atmosphere of joy, a little light invisible to the naked eye was gathering. This was the divine power of the goddess of joy being injected into the altar. She had noticed the altar that she had just built and quickly connected her faith to it. This meant that she had been silently paying attention to the city of Mordor. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, many celebrations would be held to attract the attention of the gods if an altar wanted to open. The celebration ceremony did not last long. Soon, the priest placed a girl's statue that had been prepared long ago in the center. Then a divine light emerged. This was a faint light visible to the naked eye, which meant that the goddess of joy had recognized this place as her temple. It was different from the old lady of wealth and the influential sea goddess. The strength of the Church of Joy was only enough to build a small temple. These believers would earn money through performances and then give it to the temple to gradually expand. The goddess of joy had a large number of bards as believers. The church controlled a large number of theaters and circuses, which would definitely greatly enrich the entertainment of Mordor City in the future. Soren looked down at all this from the sky. After the believer of the goddess of joy had completed all of this, he transformed into an ordinary young man and walked past the people who were immersed in the celebration, arriving at the back of the temple. No one noticed Soren's arrival, except for the golden light that appeared on the statue of the girl on the altar. "Welcome," he said. The Lord of Mordor, the protector of the half-elves." With a little bit of light, the light of faith behind the temple converged into a graceful figure of a girl. She bowed slightly to Soren and said in a pleasant voice, "Thank you very much for accepting my church. May joy be with you." The figure of the goddess of joy appeared. While bowing to Soren, she also used a relative honorific. As a veteran god, although she had existed longer than Sauron because of the level of divine power, Sauron's status was far higher than hers. In the future she would be much lower than Sauron in the Pantheon Temple. Although Mordor is ruled by order, it does not exclude joy. Soren looked at the beautiful girl in front of him and said with a smile, "I hope your arrival can bring more happiness to the civilians." Hearing Soren's words, the goddess of joy fell into deep thought. Soren's words were not a simple greeting. As a god, the goddess of joy obviously understood Soren's meaning. He could accept joy, but he couldn't accept pleasure. As for the idea of freedom of the goddess of joy, it obviously wouldn't work in Mordor. Soren pointed out the order to tell the goddess of joy that she must pay attention to this. Mordor was a city full of order. He could accept the goddess of joy, but he didn't agree with the idea of freedom of the Chaos Camp. "I understand." The goddess of joy's smile had a hint of bitterness. If it weren't for the Avatar crisis, she definitely wouldn't want her believers to develop in Mordor. But now the continent was full of war, and many people couldn't even fill their stomachs. The goddess of joy's position was more awkward. She nodded gently to Soren and said, "My believers won't bring you any trouble." "That's good." Soren smiled and said, "There will be a large celebration in Mordor soon. Maybe your church can be responsible for hosting it." He had to give her a carrot after giving her a stick. Mordor did have a celebration. As a new city, the day of the establishment of Mordor was an important celebration. Soren's military parade was also an important celebration. These celebrations were handed over to the Church of Joy to help the goddess of joy gather some believers. Looking at the believers of the Church of Joy, there were more bards than priests. Soren guessed that the goddess of joy's situation wasn't very good. Perhaps many priests couldn't give her divine spells. This was the limitation of the priesthood. The priesthood she had was not good for the time of turmoil. "Then it's time to talk about business." Soren didn't come in person to chat. He looked around, waved his hand, and a divine barrier appeared. Then he said, "I want to know the whereabouts of the goddess of abuse, Lauvita. She's your old rival. You should know something about her, right?" The goddess of joy was stunned for a moment and then said, "Is she also an enemy of Sir Soren? If it's Lauvita, I do know something about her." Soren didn't answer her question. He just looked at the goddess of joy in front of him and smiled. The Maiden of Pain has been fighting with you for thousands of years. I think you would be happy to see such an enemy disappear, right? The goddess of joy was silent. Obviously, Soren's words touched her heart and made her hate him. This famous goddess had several lovers who were priestesses in the church, and many of these priestesses died in the hands of the Maiden of Pain's believers. P.S. The first chapter. There's one more chapter. Chapter 876. Talon City. This used to be one of the few big cities in the south. However, due to the prevalence of corruption, the law gradually became a tool for the rich and powerful. Gradually, the city began to show signs of decline and decay. More and more merchants avoided this place where they needed to bribe to do anything. However, the decline of Talon City also meant the rise of some other forces. They were the forces that belonged to the gray area and the churches of many evil gods. At this moment, in an underground prison, a group of people in cloaks were kneeling in front of the altar, praying. Standing in the middle of the altar was a beautiful girl in revealing clothes. She held a long whip in her hand, and after praying for a while, she suddenly whipped herself violently. This time she used almost all of her strength. A bloody whip mark appeared on the beautiful girl's back. At this moment, the other people under the altar also took out their whips and whipped themselves. Then they knelt on the ground and prayed. Many of Lavita's believers and priests specialized in using whips. It was just like how many of Soren's believers were good at using machetes. These were all changed because of the preference of the god. All of this did not end quickly. After a period of self-abuse, the believers began the next step of the prayer ritual. This special ritual was called Flame of Candlelight. The believers first chanted hymns and danced around the burning candles. Then, under the guidance of the priest, some beautiful girls began to appear. They kept burning their bodies with the flames of the candles. At the same time, they asked other believers to drip the candles on their bodies. The whole process lasted for a while until the ritual was completed. The high-grade priest extinguished the candles with holy wine. At this moment, the ritual reached its climax. When all the believers were covered with whip marks and candles, a divine radiance appeared on the altar. Then a hazy figure of a girl appeared. Then everyone began to pray passionately. The priest even sang hymns loudly. The whole ritual lasted for about 2 hours. When everything was over, the girl on the altar gently waved her hand. A breath that made people feel peaceful and happy appeared. At this time, the priests also began to cast divine spells to heal flesh wounds. Under normal circumstances, they would only heal minor injuries. Occasionally, there would be believers who would hurt themselves badly to please the goddess. The Maiden of Pain, Lauvita, was an aggressive, domineering, and fearless goddess. She protected all the torturers, sadists, and bullies on the continent. The Maiden of Pain was obsessed with inflicting pain, whether physical or psychological. Laurita's church usually had a huge influence in large cities that were in decline, because the corrupt bureaucracy in the cities usually turned a blind eye to their corrupt behavior, and the people in power in the church were all female humans or half-elves. The church usually recruited new members from the rich and powerful of the city. Her priests were unrelenting in their tortures, or in their feigned love with the young noblemen, and then in their cruel abandonment of them, and they endeavored to destroy all affections and friendships, and then to flirt with their victims with pretended intimacy, and then to ridicule them. For the believers of the Maiden of Pain, excellent acting skills and beautiful appearances were very useful tools. The Maiden of Pain's alignment was lawful evil. Under normal circumstances, evil gods of this alignment acted like devils, and most of them had a plan. This could be seen from the teachings of the Maiden of Pain. Judging from the church's rituals, the Maiden of Pain wasn't much different from other evil gods. But if you read her teachings, you would realize that this goddess wasn't simple. The teachings of the Church of Pain were long. If you simply picked out a few, you could summarize them into the following few. This world is full of pain and suffering, so the only thing we can do is to face the inevitable pain, and pay back more pain to those who caused our pain. Article 1 of the doctrine, mercy is the best companion to pain and pain, because only mercy can deepen the pain of torture. Remember that endless cruelty and torment will only make the abused rise up in revolt, and so it is necessary to stop the torment occasionally, on a whim, and give them unexpected comfort and healing, so that they may not understand the will of the goddess, and thus the foolish people will all the more thirst for the mercy of the Maiden of Pain. The second doctrine of the Church. The whip, the flame, and the cold are the three useful tools given by the goddess to her believers. Article 6 of the doctrine: no matter when we inflict torture and punishment, we should preach the teachings of Lorita. Pain is a comprehensive trial, it can strengthen the mental resilience, and let those who have survived the ordeal gain true joy. Only those who know the rules of the goddess can inflict real punishment and abuse. Article 9 of the doctrine: wherever there is a whip, there will be goddess Lorita. Fear Lorita and desire her grace. The last paragraph of the doctrine. The teachings of the Maiden of Pain were very interesting. Especially in the last paragraph: pain is a comprehensive trial, it can strengthen the mental resilience, and let those who have survived the ordeal gain true joy. This was the highest realm of masochism. Motor City. Council Hall. When Soren decided to deal with the Maiden of Pain, all the information about her was secretly sent to him by the spies in Motor City. Soren's church did not have many things, but there were a lot of rogues, and the efficiency of collecting information was several times better than other churches. The information from the Goddess of Joy was very important, but Soren still needed to deal with the Maiden of Pain, and her church still needed to be dealt with by Soren's church. In this way he must first know the internal situation of the abused church. The other things were relatively ordinary. After reading a lot of information, Soren became a little interested in Lorita's teachings. Very surprised. Soren actually saw a little bit of positive energy in Lorita's teachings, even if it was just a nice way to put it. But if this point was used to convert, it would be of great use. Treat pain as training. If he could grasp this point and convert it, then there would be no problem with Vivian's clergy. A pure abuse clergy was still too low-end. Soren's initial goal to deal with Lorita was the pain clergy. As for the other tortures, torture, whipping and so on, they were completely unpresentable. Pain, and suffering. These were the real useful clergy. It could be applied to the gods of the evil alignment, and it could also be applied to the gods of the good alignment. The priesthoods of Vivian and Lillian were to be chosen between them. That's right. Soren thought that the clergy could be extended in two directions. Lillian was obviously in the evil alignment, and Vivian was definitely in the good alignment. Pain was the starting clergy, both of them could be considered. Chapter 877. Vivian's priesthood was initially determined. However, regarding the two extreme extensions of pain, simply speaking, it could be understood as S and M. This point still needed to be considered. Everyone cast some monthly votes to give Fu-Tu some energy. Let Fu-Tu directly evolve into the corrupted Demon King and finish writing this paragraph. Chapter 878. The morning sun shone on the city of Mordor. Last night, there was a storm in the outer islands, and many fishing boats were forced to return early. But it was strange to say that the storm raged outside the city of Mordor. Once it reached the island of Mordor, a terrible storm turned into a downpour, and the intensity of the storm was reduced by at least half. This meant that what Soren had prepared at the beginning had taken effect. The temples and arcane towers distributed in the city of Mordor had begun to affect and balance the weather conditions of the city. An invisible energy barrier had surrounded the island of Mordor, forming an artificial field effect. After the heavy rain, the city of Mordor was like a pearl. But when people got up early to prepare for work, there was a commotion on the other side of the street. Then the guards of the city of Mordor rushed over, and many curious people followed to watch. It didn't take long for the riot to subside. Many citizens of Mordor City who came to watch the fun saw the little girl who was walking a Quetzalcoatlus with a wingspan of 15 meters arrogantly with a rope as if she was walking a dog. Many new citizens were puzzled. They didn't know who this little girl was. Many old residents of Mordor smiled and looked at the cute little girl calmly. A huge Quetzalcoatlus walked past them. The little princess of Mordor. Her Highness Vivian. She hadn't shown up for so long, they thought Her Highness Vivian had gone somewhere. For the old residents of Mordor, they had long been used to such a scene. Since a long time ago, Vivian would go out for a walk with the former Quetzalcoatlus every day. It was just that the little princess had not shown up for so long, and she looked more beautiful, and the Quetzalcoatlus behind her was getting bigger and bigger. The guards consciously maintained order on both sides of the street. Vivian, on the other hand, was used to the curious gazes of the people. She held the gigantic Quetzalcoatlus in one hand and Lulu, who was almost as tall as her, in the other hand, and walked towards the beach happily. In order to fuse with the divinity, she hadn't gone out for a long time. Today she came out to walk Blackie, who she raised, and took Lulu, who had just returned from a mission, out to play for a while. After all, the little girl was only 11 years old this year. No matter how mature she was, it was inevitable that she would have some childish playful thoughts. In front was Vivian, behind was Lulu, and behind them was a huge two-legged pterosaur. Many people would gradually get used to this kind of situation because young girls like to get up early and go out for a walk. As the Pearl of Mordor City, Vivian was usually very low-key, and she was only noticeable when she went out for a walk occasionally. Vivian's awakening made Soren feel like his life was back on track. Everything was looking good. If it wasn't for the threat of the Dread Lord and the God of Murder, perhaps Soren would be more than happy to enjoy his current relaxed life. When he was free, he would manage Mordor City and study the war chess plane, making Mordor City the most dazzling city in the material plane little by little. Gloria studied alchemy technology when she was free, striving to understand the core mysteries of the arcane empire as soon as possible, striving to become a witch above level 30 as soon as possible, so that she could accompany Soren for a longer time. As for Vivian, she grew up happily and enjoyed the childhood that she should have at her age. Unfortunately, now it was the time of the Avatar crisis, and everything was just imagination. Soren only relaxed for a while, and then he began to face everything again, thinking about how to help Vivian get a clergy, and how to deal with the Dread Lord and the God of Murder at the same time. The demigod vampire was a very good example. It had to be said that this opponent still gave Soren a lot of inspiration. He gained a lot of experience from the demigod vampire when he became a god. Now if Vivian wanted to become a god, the demigod vampire was also a good comparison target. The demigod vampire used his race clergy to become a god. His domain extension was very referential. If Vivian wanted to successfully integrate the clergy, she still needed to compare with the demigod vampire. Soren already knew where the Church of the Maiden of Pain was. As for the whereabouts of Lauvita herself, the gods were more cautious in this era. Unless it was someone like Soren who had a base camp, they would not easily expose their traces. But as long as they knew that the church could slowly find her, Vivian did not need to rush to become a god. In the evening, after Soren completed the study of the legendary spell Imprisonment, he began to read the information about the gods sent back by the rogues below. Recently he paid a lot more attention to the gods. Basically, whether it was the gods of the good camp or the gods of the evil camp, Soren maintained a certain level of attention and paid attention to their movements at all times. Today, a very interesting piece of information was sent back from below. There was also an emblem in this piece of information, which was a woman's delicate lips. In the whole multiverse, there was no one who could make the emblem of a god so rippling. It seemed that there was only one so far. That was the one mentioned a long time ago, cat and dance goddess, Karis. Karis was also known as the cat and pleasure goddess. Her camp used to be chaotic and good. Later, because of the influence of Lady of Night, she tried all kinds of forbidden and taboo pleasure. As a result, she fell into chaotic and evil. Now, with the help of the goddess of love, she was restored to chaotic and neutral. She was the famous goddess who was almost broken by Lady of Night. Karis was the goddess of minor divine power. She was in charge of hedonism, sensual pleasure, large joyous celebrations, and the clergy of cats. The combat power of this goddess was relatively average, but she was a little stronger than most ordinary minor divine powers because she mastered the domains of chaos, charm, travel, and trickery. Under normal circumstances, as long as a god mastered the domain of trickery, they would not be too weak. Cherise was a radiant and beautiful goddess. Only Shuni, the goddess of love, could compare to her in terms of looks. She was a frivolous and capricious god, so very few people could really understand her true inner thoughts. Her personality was as unique and independent as a cat's, and she liked to enjoy herself. She always took care of her appearance to maintain her delicate and beautiful appearance. This was a capricious goddess. She was also one of the more famous funny goddesses among the gods because her believers also had a hobby, which was to always find various reasons to hold various kinds of celebrations that satisfied the senses. This goddess was very much like a cat. She was also a goddess who liked to wander, and was even once thought by the gods that she had wanderlust. However, because of her wanderlust, Karis directly fell into the trap of Lady of Night. She began to experience all kinds of dark pleasures and was controlled by Shar's dark power. Now, although this goddess had learned a little, her wanderlust had not changed. This was because the information in Soren's hands recorded information related to her. Her traces actually appeared in Arendelle at one time, and then there were signs that she seemed to have recently taken an airship to Port Tylon. This goddess was obviously looking for trouble again. Lady of Night had never forgotten that she had escaped from his hands, and the spies under Soren's command had found the traces of this goddess, so the other gods' churches must have found something as well. Looking at her posture, she was planning to go to the city of Moder. Soren did not have much objection to this goddess, but if this goddess of chaos encountered any trouble at that time, he did not know whether he should do it or not. For now, the goddess of cat and dance, Karis was a god under the goddess of love. Although the goddess of love was not very good at fighting, she was still a powerful god. Soren thought about it and decided to entrust the information to the goddess of love. The goddess of love, Shuni, and her gods plus various good allies. Most of the goddesses in this series were a bit funny. The Avatar crisis had caused all of these goddesses to fall. With Soren's understanding of them, he only hoped that in the middle and late stages of the Avatar crisis in the future, fewer goddesses in this series would die. P.S. Today's update. The hemorrhoids are acting up. Don't talk, Fuda needs to be alone. Chapter 879. The late stage of the Avatar crisis. The non-combat gods in the pantheon suffered the greatest loss, especially the original hedonistic goddesses. None of them had a good ending. Soren even remembered that a goddess was imprisoned by the demon duke of the Bator Inferno. He didn't know how long it took for her to be rescued. However, that was something that happened much later on. Speaking of it now, the gods had not yet fought so fiercely. At present, everyone was still relatively restrained. Time always passed very quickly without anyone noticing. In the blink of an eye, it was almost May. At this time, some signs of the third wave of the Avatar crisis had begun to appear. Motor City was located in the outer islands, so it was not obvious. However, the traces of the devils were becoming more and more frequent on the continent, especially the low-grade devils, which began to be more and more common in the wilderness. In the first two waves, the devils were not the main force, but they also gained something. Now, these gains were transformed into little devils as cannon fodder. They began to appear frequently in the wilderness and attacked various non-devil creatures at the same time. Wind Spear Hills. River Valley. Soren's figure appeared in this somewhat remote area. This was the edge of the Wind Spear Hills. The land was not very fertile, but there were thousands of residents nearby. Behind him was the high priest with a serious face, and a few other priests above the level of bishop. Then there was the ugly monkey who returned from a mission. This incident was because of the news he brought back. My lord. A priest who looked like an archbishop bowed his head humbly to Soren, and then said in a deep voice, "The news has been sent back. Recently there has been a batch of problematic food in the southern region. Many civilians began to get sick after eating it. All of these foods were planted with vicious spells. If the priests don't dispel it, people who have eaten the food will become undead creatures, and people who have been attacked by them will be infected with corpse poison." The devils finally took action. Compared with the reckless behavior of the devils were obviously more proficient in calculation and conspiracy. Nobody knew when it started, but a batch of problematic food appeared in the southern region. At first no one noticed it. However, as more and more people fell ill, people finally discovered the source of the problem. What was even more serious was that these sick people eventually turned into undead, and those who were attacked by them would also be infected with corpse poison. The southern region was the most populous place in the material plane. Once such a problem occurred, it would undoubtedly spread quickly. The Wind Spear Hills were also affected. In the valley that Soren had personally come to, there was a village where everyone had been turned into zombies. There's something wrong with this land. Soren had been watching everything silently. Then he turned his head and said to the high priest, "Send people to spread out and look for them. The soil here has been polluted. There must be a secret altar nearby. Any creature that eats what is grown on this land will be infected with a terrible disease. Tell the people below not to eat anything here, including water." Soren felt a sense of familiarity when he saw this. It was similar to what the devils usually did, but it was also similar to what the liches of the Grey Waste did. The devils liked to change the structure of the polluted land. This was because many devils were immune to poison, and in the process of attacking the abyss, the most common thing they did was to change the plain laws of a piece of land they conquered, transforming the chaotic laws of the abyss into orderly laws. In the front lines of the Blood War, many fortresses occupied by the devils were eventually transformed, and the laws of the land became more suitable for the devils. In front of Soren was a piece of transformed land. A filthy power had eroded the land. Whether it was the plants, the soil, or the rivers, everything had been corroded by this power. Although it didn't seem like there were many changes, as long as the people living here ate the things here, they would slowly get sick. In the end, it was very likely that they would be infected by the undead plague and turn into undead creatures. The method is very similar to that of the devils. But why does it look like the method of the skeletal waste? Could it be that the undead kings have begun to attack the material plane? Soren couldn't help but fall into deep thought. According to the normal historical progress, the undead creatures should attack the material plane during the fifth wave of impact. At that time, many people had died in the material plane. Many of them were entrenched in the lower planes, especially the gray waste, the spiritual realm, and the half-planes near the underworld. They left behind the history of the liches, undead kings, and so on. They felt that this was a very important opportunity. The large number of deaths in the material plane had given them a chance to show their strength, so the fifth wave of impact of the Avatar crisis broke out. This was also what the adventurers at that time jokingly called undead calamity. However, at present, although many people had died in the material plane, the proportion was not very large. Even if the undead kings of the undead system cast spells to summon souls, it was unlikely that they could gather a terrifying army of undead from the graveyard and the wild. Judging from the signs in front of him, Soren felt that it was more like the devils had drawn in and colluded with a small number of legendary liches and undead kings. They used the power of the undead creatures to weaken the strength of the material plane, and finally achieve the goal of harvesting enough souls. However, this large-scale killing of people was more like the means of the devils, and not the careful planning of the devils. Soren was a little confused for a moment. He felt that history seemed to have a more serious deviation here. That was, the third wave of impact had caused the devils, demons, and undead to take action, but their actions were not too big. The undead plague must be controlled. Otherwise, the number of people dying will become very high. And at that time, the aura of death will become stronger and stronger. By then, even if no one casts spells in the graveyard of the material plane, many corpses that have been buried long ago will crawl out. By then, I'm afraid that the fifth wave of impact will come early. According to history, the third wave of impact was the Devil Legion, the fourth wave of impact was the violent elemental life, and the fifth wave of impact was the undead calamity. The first wave of impact had caused a large number of deaths, so when the fifth wave of impact came, even the gods could not sit still anymore. During that time, it could be said that there were undead everywhere. The people who had died in the past all crawled up one by one because of their resentment, and the entire material plane was shrouded in the aura of death. Soren did not know whether it was a good thing for the undead kings to take action early, but the elemental turmoil had not yet broken out. Since he could react quickly, the god of light, the lady of Silvermoon, the goddess of agriculture, and the other gods should be able to react quickly, right? Soren thought for a long time. In the end, he decided that no matter how the future developed, the problem at hand must be solved first. He must first find the contaminated altar, and then find a way to purify this filthy land. No matter what, the undead wreaking havoc was more troublesome than the devils and demons. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.